Expand. 100,000 individuals were all thinking the same thing. Their life forces connected to the spell formation, and their souls thrummed with unyielding ardor. Their cultivation-based power made them as one, as they fought together to protect Meng Hao. Xuanfang laughed coldly, then stomped his foot down. Instantly, everything began to shake violently, and an intense rumbling sound could be heard as the 100,000 cultivators coughed up mouthfuls of blood. Meng Hao was in the middle of the spell formation, mind reeling. He couldn't simply sit there and ignore what was happening. He knew that he wasn't a match for a paragon, and also knew that all he had to do was close his eyes and wait for enough time to pass. If enough time was bought, it might be possible to hold out for that full quarter hour until the mist dispersed. At that time, he might be able to make it out alive. However, Meng Hao did not choose to wait. Performing an incantation gesture, he ceased to draw upon the power of the sun. If he continued to do so in his current state, it would deplete the life forces of the 100,000 cultivators even faster than before, which was something he wouldn't do. He strode forward, leaving the spell formation and heading toward Xuanfang, who laughed loudly, eyes shining with scorn. He had actually been worried that Meng Hao would hole up, which would have been a waste of his time. As soon as Meng Hao took action, Xuanfang suddenly vanished, and then reappeared right in front of him. Then, he raised his right hand, sending power slamming into Meng Hao that he couldn't possibly defend against. Meng Hao instantly staggered backward, blood spraying out of his mouth. Crown Prince! Crown Prince! The cries of the 100,000 cultivators rang out in anguish. As Meng Hao hovered there, his Green Emperor's eternal incantation worked constantly to prevent his body from collapsing. However, under the pressure of a paragon, he couldn't hold out for very long, and besides, his wounds had already reached a critical level. Once again, Xuanfang closed in, raising his right hand high, killing intent flickering in his eyes as he grabbed at Meng Hao's head. Just die, would you? Even as Xuanfang reached out to grab him, Meng Hao performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and then waved his finger. Demon Sealing 8th Hex. However, in the same moment that the hexing magic was unleashed and Xuanfang stopped in place, the magic was shattered. The backlash slammed into Meng Hao, causing blood to spray out of his mouth. Even though it seemed as if he were staggering backward, suddenly, time rippled in front of Meng Hao. Everything changed, causing a look of shock to appear on Xuanfang's face. His eyes widened as Meng Hao suddenly vanished, then reappeared behind him. Xuanfang turned and lunged toward him, but ended up passing right through Meng Hao, as if he were nothing more than a shadow. Xuanfang's eyes once again widened. This was not some trivial change in time, but rather contained the power of time travel. Apparently, Meng Hao had appeared several breaths of time before, right behind Xuanfang. This was none other than the strange time-walking technique that Meng Hao had learned from the Black-Robe Slaughter. When he reappeared, he was still directly behind Xuanfang, and suddenly his right hand transformed. Shockingly, the battle weapon appeared, which he raised high above his head as he took a step forward, seemingly walking from the past back into the present. A shocking blade then slashed down. Xuanfang had no time to dodge. The blade slashed from the past into the present, making it impossible to evade. For the first time, a sensation of crisis filled Xuanfang's mind. Although it wasn't a situation of deadly crisis, it was still something very rare for him to experience. Rumbling could be heard echoing out in all directions as a bright flash of light descended onto Paragon Xuanfang. Although he couldn't completely dodge, he managed to move slightly, ensuring that the blow didn't land on his forehead, but rather on his left shoulder. A boom echoed out, and blood splashed as Paragon Xuanfang's left arm was completely severed. Xuanfang fell back at top speed, face ashen, eyes flickering with killing intent toward Meng Hao. In the next instant, his severed arm exploded, transforming into a sea of golden blood which then swept out toward Meng Hao. Meng Hao trembled. He had already sustained serious injuries, and now he was coughing up more blood. His consciousness was starting to fade, and he was laughing bitterly. And yet, an unyielding gleam flared up in his eyes, and he sprang into motion, ignoring the damage he sustained in the process. In the instant in which he burst into motion, Paragon Xuanfang's right hand flashed with an incantation gesture and stabbed out viciously with his finger, causing a long golden blade to appear. The blade slashed out with ferocious speed, and before Meng Hao could even react, the meat jelly flew out and blocked the blade. A miserable shriek rang out as the meat jelly was sent flying back, clearly weakened. However, it didn't return to the bag of holding, but instead started to drag Meng Hao back into the spell formation. "You're not going anywhere," Paragon Xianfang said, his voice sinister and cold. All he had left was his right arm, which he stretched out toward Meng Hao. As he extended his fingers, essence power erupted out. 5 essences rumbled out, swirling together. Moments later, a 6th essence appeared, and then a 7th. With the addition of the essence of time, the enormous hand that had been created was filled with completely unpredictable power. Once this hand was unleashed, it was certain to strike its target. Meng Hao's face was deathly pale. In this critical moment, he shoved the meat jelly away, then suddenly reached his right hand out toward the incoming hand, toward Xianfang, then pointed his finger. Demon Sealing, 8th Hex. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the huge hand ground to a halt. However, it only lasted for a moment before it lurched into motion again. As a result, blood sprayed out of Meng Hao's mouth because of the intense backlash. That was one of the reasons he had hesitated to use the hexing magic before. If he tried to use it to tie up a paragon, not only would he fail, he would also end up hurting himself. When he had fought Igu, Chumentai had been in the process of enslaving him, which meant that the hexing magic was possible to use. But now he was fighting a full paragon, and it wasn't that his hexing magic had a problem, but rather, "My cultivation base is too low." Meng Hao laughed bitterly and gritted his teeth. As the hand closed in on him, he unleashed his essence of divine flame, then performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and waved his finger multiple times. Demon Sealing, 7th Hex. 6th Hex. 5th Hex. 3rd Hex. 2nd Hex. If he was going to risk his life, then he might as well go all out. His eyes gleamed with madness as he unleashed all of his hexing magic. Everything shook violently, and Xianfang frowned as the qi around him was thrown into chaos, and a profoundly disturbing sensation rose up. Meng Hao was trembling, and his body was collapsing into a bloody mass because of the backlash from the demon sealing hexing magic. What he really wanted to do was use the Seal the Heavens incantation, but that relied on the power of the mountains and seas, and considering that he was now isolated and cut off, it had thus failed when he tried it. Instead, he had to risk death to combine his demon-sealing hexing magics into one attack. Combining 9 hexes was the ultimate transformation a demon sealer could perform, but right now, Meng Hao only had mastery of 6 hexes. He was missing the 1st hex and the 4th, and had yet to create his own 9th hex. However, there was nothing else he could do at the moment. More than half of the quarter hour had passed, but that meant that half of that amount of time still remained. He simply couldn't hold on any longer. Meng Hao threw his head back and howled, pushing with all the power he had. His flesh and blood exploded, his bones shattered, all in his effort to fuse his hexing magics together. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out, and everyone on the sun was filled with shock. Xianfang gasped in astonishment at the sudden drastic transformations. As of this moment, the entire mountain and sea realm was trembling. The hosts of cultivators out in the starry sky were shocked, and the outsiders were shaking. Even the paragon from the 6th heaven was astounded. Dream and everyone else present felt themselves trembling. In sharp contrast was Shui Dongliu, who stood on planet South Heaven, looking anxiously in Meng Hao's direction. His eyes were filled with concern and even turmoil. Massive energy was rising up from the sun. Meng Hao shook violently as, all of a sudden, a sphere of light appeared in front of him. The light was in chaos, as 6 powers swirled around therein. It almost seemed as if that sphere of light were thinking, as if it wanted to give birth to some new entity. The intense pressure caused Paragon Xianfang's face to flicker, and for the first time, he felt a sensation of deadly crisis. Without the slightest hesitation, he began to speed backward. Even as he fell back, Meng Hao unleashed all the power he could muster, drawing upon even his life force to push the turbid sphere of light forward. He was trembling, his flesh was being shredded to pieces, revealing his bones, which then shattered. Rumbling could be heard as the sphere was pushed fully away from him. However, he was now completely drained of power. Even as he collapsed, the meat jelly scooped him up and carried him back inside the spell formation. At the same time, the sphere of light shot toward Xianfang. As it closed in, Xianfang screamed. A sensation of deadly crisis overwhelmed him, and he suddenly began to grow in size. In the blink of an eye, he was 30,000 meters tall. Then, he instantly shrank back down, turning into a shocking golden lion. His eyes flickered with the gleam of augury, as he drew upon his life force to unleash a magical technique that he hoped would help him identify the weakness in the magic he faced. Death. 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 Xu Fang's face was a mass of shock and terror. In a very short time, he performed more than 10,000 augury calculations, but no matter how he analyzed it, the end result was always the same. Death. This is impossible. Just what type of divine ability is this? Xu Fang was trembling as he fell back further. Unfortunately for him, the surrounding mist, which he had put in place to trap Meng Hao, now left him trapped. Incomplete. It's an incomplete magic. That means I have a chance. He must have injured his soul to use it. Clearly this is a Tao in the midst of percolating, which he is drawing upon early. Until he completes the Taoist magic later, it won't matter if he survives this day, he won't be able to use it again until then. Xu Fang's eyes flickered. I still have a chance, and that is, in the shadows of time. Roaring, his body flickered into motion as he unleashed his Tao of time with all the power he could. His body turned blurry, and in the blink of an eye, his undying soul appeared. I have lived for tens upon tens of thousands of years. Perhaps I have no hope of getting 8 essences, but even still, I have the ability to leave behind a soul at the end of every 60-year cycle. This is the ultimate magic of time. Unless you destroy each and every one of those souls of mine, then you can never destroy my true soul. Xu Fang's eyes were bright red. This was a magic he would only use if he had no other choice, if his life were truly in great danger. This was a life-saving magic that he could use, only once in his life. As of this moment, he was pushed to his very limit. If he didn't use the magic now, then he would die beyond the shadow of a doubt. Chapter 1360, 6 Hexes Combine. Chapter 1361, Risking It All in Battle. Xu Fang quickly became blurry as if the time around him were distorting. Gradually, it was as if tens upon tens of thousands of years flitted by, countless eons and countless images of Xu Fang. This was a consummate life-saving magic that Xu Fang had acquired after becoming a paragon and mastering the essence of time. It represented all of the 60-year cycles through the tens upon tens of thousands of years of his existence. A magical technique like this could only be described as terrifying, and with it, he could even escape unharmed from 8 essences paragons. Only by destroying all of the souls which he had left in the stream of time could he be fully destroyed. As long as one of those souls remained, he would be able to immediately and fully recover. Unfortunately for him, a consummate magic such as this was something that he could only use once in his entire life. If he abused it, the backlash caused by the great Tao of time would transform him into an aspect of time itself. His consciousness would fade away, and he would become an essence slave. By this point, 60% of the quarter hour had passed. It was already impressive enough that Meng Hao had been able to fight against the battle prowess of the 7 essences level for so long. Even more impressive was that Meng Hao had forced Xu Fang to unleash a consummate magic like this, even if Meng Hao lost in the end. He had fought in epic fashion. Paragon Xu Fang threw his head back and roared, completely unleashing the full power of his consummate magic. He could not evade the chaotic, soul-locking sphere of light, so he faced it directly, stretching his arms out in front of him and viciously jabbing forward with his fingers. Massive booms rang out as everything in the space around Xu Fang twisted and distorted in the direction of the sphere, then slammed into it, instantly crushing it. I'm betting on the fact that this magic is incomplete. I'm betting that such an incomplete magic is insufficient to destroy all of my souls throughout time. Xu Fang threw his head back and roared as his essence of time made contact with the turbid light sphere, resulting in a blinding explosion. Strangely, light did not shine past the 300-meter border of the sphere. However, the area inside of it became like another sun, filled with scintillating, dazzling light. Within that 300-meter area, Paragon Xu Fang's expression twisted ferociously. The turbid sphere of light vanished and became 6 streams of smoke that bored into the essence of time. Within those tens upon tens of thousands of years of time, the 6 streams of smoke began to eradicate Paragon Xu Fang's souls. No sound could be heard, and yet within the twisting time that surrounded Paragon Xu Fang, numerous flashes of extermination could be seen as more than 10% of his souls were wiped out. The loss of 10% of his souls caused an unsightly expression to appear on Paragon Xu Fang's face. However, that number quickly increased to 20%, then 30, 40, and even 50. When the destruction passed 50%, Paragon Xu Fang's eyes shone with intense terror, astonishment, and even disbelief. He refused to believe that he would perish this day, and refused to believe that he had miscalculated. Furthermore, He refused to believe that his most powerful life-saving magic, which could only be used once in a lifetime, was incapable of standing up to an incomplete Taoist magic. "Impossible," he roared. Instantly, his blood surged in his body, causing the chi and blood of the souls within the rippling time to erupt with intense soul power. At the same time, the 6 strands of smoke were beginning to run out of power after having exterminated 50% of Xianfang's souls. However, they still managed to spread out, increasing the destruction to 60%. Only then did they begin to show signs that they would fade away. Soon, 70% of the souls had been eradicated, and the 6 streams of smoke were now fading away. They pushed hard, but in the end, couldn't quite exterminate 80% of Xianfang's souls before, completely vanishing. When that happened, Meng Hao coughed up a huge mouthful of blood, then sagged in exhaustion. His face was completely drained of blood, and the backlash from what had just occurred shattered his internal organs and left his entire body vibrating. His cultivation base was teetering, and his consciousness was fading. He had lost. He didn't even have the energy to chuckle bitterly. He knew that he had been completely and utterly defeated. He had never failed in such bitter fashion before. Even his desperate fight with Lord White of the Seventh Mountain and Sea had ended in victory. However, on this day, despite having done everything in his power, he was left without the slightest hope of victory. Meng Hao's heart swelled with bitterness and pain. The Green Emperor's eternal incantation was still working, but without sufficient time, he wouldn't recover enough to even lift his hand and unleash a divine ability. Besides, as of this moment, time was like a sharp blade hanging over Meng Hao's neck. Only about 70% of the quarter hour had passed, and to hang on for any longer would be extremely difficult. Because the battlefield on the outside was obscured by the covering of mist, and because Meng Hao could not allow distractions during his battle with Paragon Xianfang, he could only get a general sense that the situation on the outside was equally discouraging. Xianfang was some distance away from the sun's spell formation itself, trembling. The 300 meters of light around him was quickly fading away, along with Meng Hao's Taoist magic that was the combined 6 hexes. Soon, Paragon Xianfang himself was revealed. He was in extremely bad condition, his hair disheveled, his body soaked with sweat. A complicated expression could be seen on his face, as if he had just experienced a near-death catastrophe. Then he turned to look toward the spell formation, and Meng Hao sitting there, completely drained of energy. In the 33 heavens, the only people who could force me into a situation like this would be the 2 8 essences paragons. But now, another person like that exists. You. Xianfang gave Meng Hao a profound look, then clasped hands and bowed. "This bow is a bow of respect to you. I have no choice but to kill you, but at the same time, you have my admiration. Different mindsets have led to this war, and have thus our battle here. I understand you had no choice in the matter. However, despite being a paragon, I'm only at the 7 essences level, so I had little choice myself. Meng Hao, I will remember your name, and now the time has come for you to leave this world forever." Xianfang took a deep breath. Of all his souls that existed within the stream of time, nearly 80% had been destroyed. However, as long as even a single one remained, he could not be truly killed. The main thing he regretted was it was a magical technique that he could never again unleash. If Meng Hao somehow managed to unleash that incomplete Taoist magic a second time, then he would die beyond the shadow of a doubt. Meng Hao sat there silently, sighing inwardly. It was a critical moment of life or death, and yet he felt no fear. Instead, he thought about his life after his parents went missing, about being a scholar in Yunji County, about the imperial examinations, and about the events on Mount Daqing which had led to him entering the world of cultivation and the Tao. His life flashed before his eyes, images of his family, his wife, his friends. Rumbling sounds echoed out as Xianfang took a step forward to enter the spell formation itself. Just when he was about to reach out and exterminate Meng Hao, an enraged roar echoed out, from none other than the 100,000 cultivators that Xianfang had completely disregarded this entire time. No words were spoken, no explanations were given. There was only a furious cry that echoed out from the depths of their souls. 100,000 cultivators' eyes were all completely bloodshot as they unleashed the power of their cultivation bases, and even their life force, to fight back against Paragon Xianfang. They would not allow him to enter the spell formation, and they would not allow him to harm Meng Hao. Xianfang's eyes flickered, and he snorted coldly, stomping his foot down viciously. The entire sun shuddered as a massive wave of power shot out toward the spell formation and Meng Hao. Meng Hao had not received numerous injuries, but the injuries he did receive had been extremely grievous. Therefore, it was the 100,000 cultivators who absorbed the powerful attack. Blood sprayed out of their mouths, and there were some whose bodies withered to the point of collapse. This sudden development wrenched Meng Hao out of his reverie regarding past memories. To see 100,000 people refusing to yield, determined to give up their own lives rather than allow him to be killed, caused his entire body to tremble. Xuanfang was also moved. Inwardly, he sighed, unsure of what to say at this point. However, he continued to press the attack as viciously as ever. His killing intent rocketed up as he took 8 steps forward, forcing his way through the spell formation toward Meng Hao. With each step he took, the spell formation trembled violently. The 100,000 cultivators coughed up more blood, and some even withered away into death, allowing the spell formation to draw upon them until they were killed, all for the purpose of protecting Meng Hao. Perhaps it would be most accurate to say that what they were protecting was not just Meng Hao, but their home. For some groups of people, the destruction of their homeland will lead, not to a thirst for revenge, but to hopelessness and confusion. However, there are some people whose spirits cannot be exterminated. For a people like that, when the critical moment arrives in which the survival of their homeland is on the line, then the only choice will be sacrifice. Those were the type of people whose vengeance would live for all eternity even after their homeland was destroyed. Sacrifice oneself to defend one's home. Wars are never truly fought over resources. Or perhaps it is most accurate to say that when wars are fought over resources, then regardless of how many casualties are suffered, they are relatively tame. The true brutality of war comes when the goal is to crush the spirit and will of an entire people. Only by wiping out the spirit and the will of a people can that people be truly exterminated. When exterminating a people, what is exterminated is not just life, but the heart and soul of the entire people. In the opening stages of the war between the mountain and sea realm and the 33 heavens, Meng Hao had ignited a fire. He had burned the land mass that was the first heaven to illuminate the eyes of the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. He had awakened the spirit and the soul of the people. When that happened, the war changed. Perhaps the 33 heavens could exterminate the people of the mountain and sea realm, but they could not exterminate the souls of its cultivators. As of this moment, every step Paragon Xuanfang took resulted in one cultivator after another making the ultimate sacrifice. Blood flowed and bodies withered. They used their deaths to buy time. "You don't need to do this," Meng Hao said through bleary eyes, his body trembling. He looked around at the group of cultivators around him. They were people he had never even seen before the war started. They were strangers. They had their own families, sex, loved ones, even children. But now, it was without hesitation that they gave up their own lives to slow Xuanfang's steps. Bodies withered and souls faded away. They were like candles in the wind, sputtering on the verge of being snuffed out. Finally, a desperate howl echoed out from Meng Hao's mouth. A blood-colored flicker appeared in his eyes, and a flame suddenly burned within him as he looked up at Xuanfang. As of this moment, Meng Hao had played all of his cards. There was only one thing left to do. He waved his hand, drawing fully upon the power of his life force to summon all of his 33 soul lamps. /expand. Of his 33 soul lamps, 6 were already extinguished. The other 27 still burned. Of the 7 desolations, he had completely passed the first, and had experienced one tribulation in the second desolation, leaving 4 more lamps before that desolation was passed. In the past, whenever he extinguished soul lamps, he had only done so after being completely confident of the outcome. But now, it was a critical moment. Tens of thousands of cultivators were dying to protect him. Therefore, despite lacking complete confidence, he felt that he had no other choice. As one cultivator after another withered up and died, Meng Hao gritted his teeth, and his eyes gleamed with determination. The flame which burned inside him only continued to grow hotter as it prepared to burn, not himself, but others. Without any further hesitation, he lifted his right hand and pointed at his 7th soul lamp. "Extinguish," he said, pushing out with all of the power he could muster, unleashing the last scrap of his divine will to crush down onto the 7th soul lamp. It was like a wind had gusted past the lamp. The flame flickered and then was snuffed out. A curl of smoke floated up, which instantly bored into Meng Hao through his mouth and nose. As it spread out through his body, he began to shake, and blood oozed out of his eyes, ears, nose, and mouth. His cultivation base began to rumble, and his fleshly body filled, first with numbness, then stabs of pain. It was almost as if his body was a combination of both yin and yang, with one half being icy cold and the other scorching hot. His cultivation base was now growing. Before, it had been almost completely spent, but now it was recovering. As it did, his body withered rapidly under the simultaneous freezing and scorching of yin and yang. In the blink of an eye, he was nothing more than a pile of flesh and bones. Furthermore, the sensation of deadly crisis within him soared to incredible heights. It almost felt like his body was about to be transformed into nothing more than ash. Paragon Xianfang's eyes glowed brightly as he looked at Meng Hao's soul lamps. Although his expression remained neutral inside, he was being battered by massive waves of shock. His cultivation base. Despite being shocked, he began to walk faster. The will of a paragon spread out, and more of the 100,000 cultivators withered, many of them transforming into ash. Of the 100,000 people, only half remained alive. However, not a single one of that remaining group chose to give up. It wasn't that they lacked a fear of death, but rather, they understood that Meng Hao was more important than all of them added together. For the mountain and sea realm, for their families, for their friends, they were willing to die to prevent Meng Hao from perishing. Your people are looking to die, Paragon Xianfang roared, pushing forward, unleashing his cultivation base, sending a divine ability roaring out. There were now 50,000 cultivators left, and even as blood spurted out of their various wounds, Meng Hao chuckled bitterly. He wasn't sure whether or not he would die, but he did know that the power of one extinguished soul lamp was not enough to recover his cultivation base. His eyes gleamed with cold light, and he clenched his jaw viciously. Extinguishing a single soul lamp doesn't count as risking it. His divine will exploded out to extinguish his 8th soul lamp. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the flame flickered, then suddenly winked out. Smoke poured into Meng Hao's body, and he lifted his head up and let out a piercing howl. Then he slowly rose to his feet, his energy rapidly returning to its previous heights. Simultaneously, the intense sensation of imminent danger exploded up within him. His body had already been extremely withered, but now it got even worse, to the point where nothing seemed to remain behind other than skin and bones. And yet, his eyes shone with indescribable intensity. He leaped up into the air, his energy soaring, surrounded by rumbling sounds. He flew out from the center of the spell formation toward Xianfang, whose face instantly fell. At the same time, Xianfang clenched his hand into a fist and unleashed a punch. Meng Hao's expression was vicious, and his overall appearance completely ferocious. The second desolation would not be immediately fatal, which gave Meng Hao time to take 3 steps forward and use his god-slaying fist to meet Paragon Xianfang's punch. A massive boom echoed out as the 2 fists slammed into each other. A tremor ran through Xianfang. He might be a paragon, but his short battle with Meng Hao had left him completely and utterly shaken. His chi and blood were set aboil, and his eyes burned with killing intent. Just when he was about to unleash another attack, Meng Hao coughed up a mouthful of blood. Then, a wild gleam appeared in his eyes, and he waved his hand toward his 9th soul lamp, unexpectedly. He was planning to extinguish that soul lamp too. "Are you crazy?" Xianfang blurted in shock. He had never seen anyone successively extinguish one soul lamp after another. Doing that was courting almost certain death. Eyes glittering coldly, he asked, "Are you that set on killing me before you die?" Just when he was about to launch another attack, he realized that after extinguishing his 9th soul lamp, Meng Hao was actually extinguishing the 10th. When both of those soul lamps were extinguished, their smoke poured into Meng Hao's nose and mouth, filling his body and causing his cultivation base to rise explosively. At the same time, his battle prowess reached a completely shocking level. He had just extinguished 4 soul lamps in one effort, which filled him with 4 times the power he had commanded when initially igniting his ancient realm soul lamps. Right now, his cultivation base and battle prowess exceeded that of an imperial lord. He was now only slightly behind a paragon in terms of power. In terms of his divine sense, it also experienced explosive growth. Now, it wasn't 80% as powerful as a paragon's, it was equal to paragon's or even slightly more powerful. With divine sense power like that, coupled with his cultivation base and battle prowess, it was possible to say that Meng Hao was now completely qualified to fight to the death with a paragon. At the same time, his Green Emperor's eternal incantation surged into action, constantly restoring him, ensuring that his battle prowess was truly at its peak. Unfortunately, the aura of death which surrounded him was incredibly strong, and was soon reaching its peak as well. In addition, the second desolation was so intense that his already emaciated frame was beginning to completely rot. Blisters appeared all over him, which let out an aura of rot after they popped. There were even some places where his flesh had turned into a bloody mush, revealing blackened bones. Those bones had long since been tainted by some sort of curse power. However, Meng Hao ignored all of that, striding forward at increasing speed until he was right in front of Paragon Chuan-Fang. There, he lifted his right hand and performed an incantation gesture. The mountain-consuming incantation exploded out, causing Chuan-Fang's face to flicker. He could see how terrifying Meng Hao was at this moment, and thus, he didn't hesitate at all to snort coldly and fall back into retreat. He didn't want to have anything to do with Meng Hao at the moment. As far as he could tell, Meng Hao was doomed to die, and therefore, there was no reason to continue fighting him and join him in death. Besides, in his current state, Meng Hao was completely fear-inspiring, even to Chuan-Fang. Trying to run away, Meng Hao said, lips twisting into a smile. As of this moment, he didn't care if he was dying. The only thing he was concerned with right now was making sure Chuan-Fang died with him. He was convinced that Chuan-Fang had no more soul-saving magics left. There was no way for him to evade death. Besides, Meng Hao had the echelon mark left by Paragon C Dream, which meant that he was more than qualified to battle with this 7 Essences Paragon. Although eking out a victory wouldn't be easy, neither would it be easy for the Paragon to slay him. Rumbling echoed out as Meng Hao picked up speed, transforming into a black rock. And yet, this rock was also little more than skin and bones. It was as if it had just climbed up out of the grave, completely ferocious in appearance, with a strong aura of death surrounding it as it slashed its claws toward Chuan-Fang. Chuan-Fang's face flickered as he sent out all of the essence power he could muster. Meng Hao in rock form slammed into him, and the rock shattered, revealing Meng Hao himself, who staggered backward, coughing up blood. Virtually all of his flesh and blood were destroyed, with nearly half of him being nothing more than bones. And yet, Paragon Chuan-Fang was also coughing up blood. In the face of this maddened Meng Hao, he didn't hesitate at all to yet again fall back into retreat. Regardless of anything, there was no way he would give Meng Hao a chance to drag him along into death. It was at this exact moment that the quarter hour ended. Suddenly, the surrounding mist began to roil, and then in the blink of an eye vanished. "Heaven is helping me," laughed Chuan-Fang, his eyes glittering. With that, he flew off of the sun, content with having made a huge accomplishment within the mountain and sea realm. Meng Hao is going to die, and the mountain and sea realm's shield will soon shatter. Almost as soon as the mist vanished, Meng Hao could see that beyond the first sea, and beyond the shield, the second heaven was bearing down. The shield was twisting, sinking in, covered with countless, madly flickering magical symbols. Paragon C Dream was not in the vicinity. She could not abandon the shield only because of Meng Hao. Now she was below the shield, using all her power to bolster it. Meng Hao's Paragon puppet had lost its connection to his divine will when he was in his fierce fight with Chuan-Fang. Now, it had nothing left but its instincts as it hovered there beyond the region where the mist had been. It was at this point that the land mass that was the second heaven smashed into the mountain and sea realm's shield. A huge, ear-splitting boom echoed out through the entire mountain and sea realm, causing all the cultivators' minds to reel, and their ears to fill with piercing pain. It was the same with the outsiders beyond the shield that protected the first sea. When Meng Hao saw all of this, some of the madness in his eyes faded away. He watched as the huge land mass bashed into the shield, which then shattered into countless fragments. When that happened, blood sprayed out of Paragon C Dream's mouth, and she suddenly seemed to age. On the moon, blood sprayed out of the mouths of 100,000 cultivators as their bodies were shredded and transformed into nothing more than ash. Kesidigarbha's demon form collapsed, and he returned to his previous cultivator appearance. Blood sprayed out of his mouth, and he sagged in exhaustion. Apparently, his Tao foundation was now unstable. The already cracked land mass that was the second heaven now entered the mountain and sea realm, transforming into countless meteors that hailed down. At the same time, the millions upon millions of outsiders waiting outside the first sea let out excited roars as they charged in. The tide of battle had completely shifted. Chapter 1362, Extinguishing 4 Soul Lamps. /expand. In the first sea, the mountain and sea cultivators were already engaging in fierce fighting with the outsiders. Unending rubble from the shattered second heaven rained down, some of it piercing down to land on the mountain and sea below it, and even the planets there. Incredible casualties resulted. The war was no longer balanced. The situation was now anything but that, and it was all because of Xianfang. The reason why the mountain and sea realm was now in such an unfavorable position was because of Xianfang. As of this moment, a cold smile could be seen on Xianfang's mouth as he sped along, intent on leaving the mountain and sea realm. His plan had worked. Meng Hao was destined to die, and the mountain and sea shield was broken. Of course, he had been seriously injured in the process, and he now needed to leave the mountain and sea realm to recover. Control of the war effort would now be handed over to the other paragon. However, even in the moment in which he hoped to flee, a rotting skeletal figure appeared, which was Meng Hao. Laughing a grating maniacal laugh, he smiled and said, "Paragon Xianfang, you threw yourself out as bait, so why are you in such a hurry to leave? You might be a paragon, but you can't just waltz in and out of the mountain and sea realm whenever you feel like it." Even as he spoke, Meng Hao reached out and crushed some unknown object with his right hand. Simultaneously, the lightning cauldron appeared above his head and electricity danced. Rumbling echoed out as Paragon Xianfang, regardless of whether he was willing or not, suddenly switched locations with Meng Hao. It was form displacement transposition. As soon as he reappeared, he frowned and let out a cold harumph. However, only a moment later, his face fell as he realized that a thick mist was spreading out around him. "Gloompearl, you can use gloompearls too, right? Your aura of death." Xianfang's face fell as he remembered that, when fighting with Meng Hao earlier, Meng Hao had taken one of the gloompearls. Xianfang had forgotten that point, but now it was obvious what was happening. Normally, gloompearls could only be used by means of a special technique. The only way someone unfamiliar with that technique could activate a gloompearl was if they had an intense aura of death surrounding them. And of course, that was exactly the state Meng Hao was in, enabling him to use the gloompearl. Paragon Xianfang's heart began to pound, and his expression was very grim. The mist seethed, completely locking him in place where he was. He would now need a full quarter hour before he could move. "Well, you won't be able to cause a big stir within a quarter hour. Let me guess, Meng Hao. You plan to give your last bit of life to Sea Dream, or perhaps use the Egu puppet to try to kill our other paragon. Right. You won't succeed in a mere quarter hour." Even as his sinister voice echoed out from within the mist, the sixth heaven's paragon suddenly stepped down into the starry sky. After glancing in the direction of Meng Hao and Xianfang, he sent his cultivation base power out to block Sea Dream and the paragon puppet. He actually wasn't worried about Xianfang. He was concerned about Sea Dream and the Egu puppet. As far as Meng Hao went, he had confidence in Xianfang's methods and was sure that Meng Hao would soon die. Sea Dream was shaken as she looked over at Meng Hao and his intense aura of death. At the same time, Meng Hao's divine will once again connected with the paragon puppet, and its eyes began to glow. However, Meng Hao's divine will was rife with an aura of death, causing the puppet to also be surrounded with the same aura. In response to Paragon Xianfang's words, Meng Hao merely smiled and didn't say a word. Considering his current state, that smile looked completely ferocious. Meng Hao knew that right now, it would be impossible to kill Xianfang, and therefore all he wanted to do was lock him down temporarily. In this critical moment of danger for the mountains and seas, the balance of the war needed to be restored. Meng Hao's eyes shone with a strange light. With that, he extended his right hand toward the area that contained the mist, and then waved his hand slightly. As he did, a thread appeared, a horizontal thread down below the mist. Then Meng Hao made a second stroke with his hand, then a third and a fourth. The four threads connected to form a circle that completely surrounded the mist. Inside that mist, Paragon Xianfang's face flickered as he sensed the fluctuations of essence. That's the essence of space. Even in the moment in which surprise filled Xianfang, the eyes of the other paragon went wide. That paragon didn't move in to help, but instead raised a hand high up toward the third heaven and pointed. It was in the same moment that the aura of essence exploded out from the circle in front of Meng Hao. It was the power of spatial sealing. Meng Hao couldn't use his essence of space for a long period of time, but because he had extinguished 4 soul lamps, causing an explosive growth in his cultivation base, he was able to unleash power formidable enough to seal a paragon. Of course, Meng Hao was not powerful enough to completely banish him. This was only a sealing, and a temporary one at that, but it would definitely last many times more than a quarter hour. "Seal," he said, his voice grating. As it echoed out, the circle flashed with light and began to solidify. Paragon Xianfang let out a maddened roar. Even as the seal was completed, he apparently burned his life force to send the circle flying out with an incredible burst of speed. It shot toward the darkness-cloaked Paragon, who quickly reached a hand out and grabbed it. Meng Hao sighed. Paragons were hard to kill, which was something he now had deep understanding of thanks to experience. However, the circle had solidified, and the seal created by the essence of space was completed. That seal would not be easily unraveled without first spending many months working at it. Even when the seal was opened, Paragon Xuanfang had burned his life force, and before that had been seriously injured. Even if he was still at the Paragon level at that time, his battle prowess would be reduced by at least half. Most important was not Paragon Xuanfang's cultivation base, but rather his tactics. What he had done caused Meng Hao to burn with the desire to kill him. At least trapping him for several months would prevent further unexpected situations from arising in battle. All of the cultivators and outsiders who were fighting near the first mountain saw what happened and were shaken. When the mountain and sea realm's shield was broken, the balance of battle was disturbed, but now that Meng Hao had sealed Paragon Xuanfang, everything changed, and the fighting was evening up. As for the Paragon puppet, now that it was under the control of Meng Hao's divine sense, its eyes flickered, and it shot toward the first sea, clearly intent on using its Paragon power to slaughter more outsiders. His mission was to tip the balance of battle in favor of the mountain and sea realm. If the remaining outsider Paragon wanted to save the outsiders in the first sea, he would have to face the combined might of Meng Hao, the Eagle Puppet, and Sea Dream. If he did that, he would definitely end up dead or seriously injured. Considering the situation, the darkness-cloaked outsider Paragon sighed. He was not like Xuanfang with his crafty battle plans. Having no other options, he had to rely on his own methods, and the truth was that the moment Xuanfang had been sealed, he had already made his decision. With the wave of a finger, the land mass that was the third heaven began to rumble as if it were about to move toward the mountain and sea realm. Apparently, he was going to use the same technique as before, sending the entire third heaven in a crushing attack onto the mountain and sea realm. From the look of things, he didn't even care about the outsiders who were currently still in the third heaven. His mood had gone foul, and he chose to use his own style to fight this war. At the same time, his voice echoed out into the starry sky. The power of a paragon will once again be unleashed on the battlefield. I will pay any price, including the destruction of the third, fourth, fifth, and even the sixth heaven, to strike at the mountain and sea realm. As his voice echoed out, the paragon puppet stopped in place, and a strange light began to gleam in Sea Dream's eyes as she looked up. As for Meng Hao, he was losing consciousness, and a will of death was taking grip upon his body. He knew that he couldn't hold on much longer, and yet he gritted his teeth and looked up at the paragon puppet from the sixth heaven. "Mountain and sea paragons," the outsider paragon said, his voice ringing with determination. "Hold back from fighting, and I will hold back from unleashing the land mass attack." As his words rang out, Paragon Sea Dream's face flickered. For a long, tense moment she hesitated, apparently unwilling to yield, and yet in the end she flicked her sleeve and gave Meng Hao a meaningful look. Under the direction of Meng Hao's divine will, the paragon puppet fell back. The outsider paragon from the sixth mountain breathed an inward sigh of relief. The truth was that he didn't want to destroy the third through sixth heavens. He wasn't adept at leading wars, and therefore, he simply wanted to buy time until the seventh heaven and the others arrived. He wasn't aware of it, but if Xuanfang were present, he would be incensed at such tactics. Xuanfang didn't care about life or death, and would definitely have gone to the length of destroying the land masses in order to prevent Meng Hao from recovering. He would not have given the mountain and sea realm the slightest bit of breathing room, or the slightest chance to gain an advantage. By slamming those 5 land masses into the mountain and sea realm, it would likely destroy all of the mountains and seas, and would force the mountain and sea realm to draw upon whatever deep reserve powers they were holding back. In that case, they wouldn't need to wait for the seventh heaven and the others to arrive in order to clinch a victory. For decisive people, hesitation and delay were not options. That could lead to a drop in the outsider's morale. Most important of all was that the decision of this second paragon actually bought time for the mountain and sea realm. Using the second heaven to attack had been an unexpected twist, but now, the mountain and sea realm would definitely prepare for such a thing to happen again. As such, further threats of using all the other land masses themselves would be somewhat hollow, and following through on such threats less effective. That, of course, was why Paragon Sea Dream had pretended to be so torn after hearing the outsider Paragon's words, and also the reason she gave the meaningful look to Meng Hao. After all, this decision was a good thing for the mountain and sea realm. The war continued. Bitter fighting went on in the First Sea, but the Paragons didn't participate. Meng Hao couldn't hold on any longer. After coughing up another mouthful of blood, he lapsed into a coma. As he fell down out of the sky, Paragon Sea Dream shot forward to catch him. The aura of death which surrounded became much thicker and his body was rotting away. His organs, his bones, and his flesh were all turning into ash. Grief covered Sea Dream's face, and she was just about to begin to treat his injuries, when an ancient voice echoed out from behind her, a voice which caused her to tremble. "Let me handle this." Chapter 1363, Sealing a Paragon. The War of the Mountain and Sea Realm continued. The sun had lost Meng Hao, so Paragon Sea Dream arranged for the Lord of the Eighth Mountain and Sea, Meng Hao's grandfather, to temporarily take control. The 100,000 cultivators were reinforced, and under Grandpa Meng's control, the sun once again became a powerful weapon and threat. The army of outsiders did not enter the First Sea en masse to fight. They were split into 5 divisions, each one of which was directed by an imperial lord. In addition to that, various Dao realm experts were also placed within those forces. Currently, the group fighting with the mountain and sea cultivators in the First Sea consisted of the first division of several million outsiders. The First Sea was almost completely dried up, and so stained with blood that the redness would never be expunged. The reek of gore filled the air, and the brutality of battle caused the starry sky to grow dark. Even the dazzling glow caused by the unleashing of divine abilities and magical techniques was darkened by the sea of blood. Only hoarse shouts and shrill screams could be heard echoing out constantly across the battlefield. The only reason that the first line of defense hadn't been broken was because the darkness-cloaked outsider Paragon was a cautious person, and his deepest instinct and inclination was to keep buying time. Were it not for that, he might have resorted to using the land masses to strike the mountain and sea realm. In fact, if Paragon Xu and Fang hadn't been sealed, the battle being fought would have been 100 times more brutal. Actually, it was because of the cautious decisions being made by the other Paragon that Sea Dream chose to utilize one particular stratagem ahead of schedule, long before the second division of outsiders launched an offensive. The mountain and sea cultivators who made up the first line of defense, despite having reinforcements to relieve them, were gradually growing exhausted. Furthermore, the First Sea was on the verge of being completely dried up. The mountain and sea cultivators were pushed back relentlessly, and soon, the second division of outsiders began to advance into battle. Even as that second division set foot into the First Sea, Paragon Sea Dream's eyes glittered. Without any hesitation, she performed an incantation gesture, sending an order out to Su Qing. In turn, Su Qing suppressed her concern for Meng Hao and excitedly passed the order along to the army. Soon, magical symbols began to glitter throughout the sea of blood that was the First Sea. Waves kicked up, and then the First Sea, unexpectedly, self-detonated. Although not much sea water was left in it, it was still a sea. Most importantly, the First Sea had its will, which was really a part of the will of the mountain and sea realm as a whole. In fact, the self-detonation of the First Sea was, most accurately speaking, a detonation of the will of the First Sea. Rumbling could be heard as the water in the First Sea began to bubble and seethe. Then, destructive power exploded out from every drop of water, from every wave, from every part of the entire sea. The resulting explosion caused the entire mountain and sea realm to shake, even the planets. After a moment of shock, the Paragon from the sixth heaven took a step forward, and then looked grimly in the direction of the First Sea. A terrifying shockwave was spreading out, starting from the very middle of the First Sea. There, a black hole appeared, which immediately sent out a terrifying gravitational force. It was like the power of heaven and earth itself were sucking in the sea of blood, as well as numerous outsiders. The outsiders were thrown into complete chaos. Their first and second divisions were crying out in alarm as they began to spiral toward the black hole. As for the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm, even as the gravitational force appeared, something exceedingly powerful grabbed a hold of them and pulled them out of the First Sea. The black hole almost appeared to be breathing. It sucked in a huge breath, and then, the true power of self-detonation appeared. Massive rumbling could be heard as a huge blast swept out across heaven and earth. Everywhere it passed, outsiders screamed as first their flesh and blood were flayed, then their bones were crushed, and finally their nascent divinities were transformed into ash. The intense power of self-detonation exploded out, and in the blink of an eye, it covered the entire area of the First Sea, completely enveloping the forces of the first and second divisions of outsiders. Few were able to flee. Not even ordinary Tao realm experts or Tao lords were qualified to do such a thing. Only those few who were in the four essences level managed to avoid being enveloped by the insanity of the explosion. Heaven and earth trembled and the starry sky shook. Outside of the mountain and sea realm, the rest of the army was shaken and stared in terror and shock. Even the 6 imperial lords gasped. The force of the self-detonation lasted for 3 full days, during which time the mountain and sea cultivators stood on one side of the sea, silent, and the outsiders stood on the other side, shocked. After 3 days, the reverberations of the explosion died down. The first sea would never be seen again for all eternity. The mountain and sea realm had lost one of its seas, although along with it went all the outsiders inside of it. The rest of the outsiders stood there silently, as did the mountain and sea cultivators. The first sea was gone. For the first time in the war, the mountain and sea cultivators felt what it was like to lose one of their mountains or seas. The sensation left them in a bit of a daze. Soon, though, the fighting continued. The third division of outsiders was ordered into action by their paragon. This time, 2 imperial lords joined in the fighting, as well as numerous Tao realm experts, all of whom began to advance upon the first mountain. Only half of the mountain and sea realm's first line of defense remained. The entire first mountain turned into a battleground, and soon the fierce fighting caused the entire mountain to be stained red with blood. Even as the rumbling of battle echoed out, Meng Hao remained in a coma, completely unaware of what was happening around him. He was like a drifting soul in a strange world. That world had no sky, no land, no trees or plants, no mountains or rivers. There was only a faint mist within which could be seen 2 enormous statues. The facial features of the statues were obscured, but one thing that Meng Hao could sense was that the statue on the left pulsed with a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering demonic qi. As the 9th generation demon sealer, Meng Hao could sense how powerful that demonic qi was. Furthermore, it clearly contained some of the aura of the mountains and seas. There was something strange about it, something multifarious. Even more so, it possessed a frenzied desire to kill which, contrary to expectation, was not deranged and mad, but cold and calculating. The aura which surrounded the statue made it extremely bizarre, and even though Meng Hao couldn't see its face, he was certain that its expression was both ferocious and benevolent. It was the type of face that seemed to be crying, and yet laughing at the same time. It was as if the statue actually had 1,000 faces, making it impossible to tell what emotion truly lay within. It was a demon. Because of its multifariousness, it became demonic, and this statue seemed as if it were the world's sole and perfect exemplar of a demon. As for the statue on the right, when Meng Hao looked at it, he could sense an immortal qi so concentrated that it caused everything in the area to tremble. It was as if this were the perfect expression of all immortals, as if this were the only immortal that existed in the world. Meng Hao looked silently at the 2 statues, and then glanced around at the world which surrounded him. He felt bewildered, unsure of where he was, and confused regarding exactly what these 2 statues depicted. Even as Meng Hao began to question what was happening, an ancient voice spoke to him, a voice which seemed to echo out from primeval times, to fill the world in which he stood. This place exists inside your heart of hearts. His mind trembled and he looked up, but could not see the owner of the voice. It was as if the voice was everywhere and nowhere. Look at these 2 statues. One is the demon, the other is the immortal. In the paragon immortal realm, a birth was foreordained. The vast expanse is one and only, immortal. That is why the all-heaven bloodline emerged. However, there were certain people who did not wish for the immortal to be born. They wanted to supplant that position. That is because, although the immortal and the god complement one another, the immortal is above the god and can also suppress the devil. The god and the devil cared not, but their descendants cared. Thus the heavens were reversed, karma was altered, and time was rifled with. They were willing to pay any price, and they succeeded. Yet they also failed. Furthermore, they were unaware that, because of the changes wrought by the mix of success and failure, they unwittingly caused something to happen which should not have. The immortal became the demon. That is because the world in which the immortal was to be born was a world that existed before the all-heaven bloodline had appeared. That world was a world which suppressed the 3,000 greater demons. It was the paragon demon realm. The demon is multifarious and bizarre, changeable. It is not righteous and noble like the immortal. It cannot suppress the devil, nor can it shake the god. However, what it can do is topple the vast expanse. And now the time has come for you to ask yourself, if you had the choice, would you become the mighty and powerful immortal, or would you become the demon which can topple the vast expanse? As the ancient voice echoed out, it was possible to tell that there was no power of compulsion within it. It simply wished to hear an answer to the question. Meng Hao maintained his silence. He looked over at the left-hand statue which represented the demon. Before, the face had not been visible, but now it suddenly was. What Meng Hao found himself looking at was his own face. He had towering demonic chi and eyes that glowed with a redness that would never be extinguished. There was no haughty conceit, no extreme domineering air. There was no righteous nobility, and there was no dignity. However, there was a multifariousness, a changeability, a bizarreness. Furthermore, within those red eyes there was the sensation of a hatred as fathomless as a sea of blood, something that wished to destroy the entire world. And yet deep within the eyes, concealed beneath the thousand multifarious, changeable faces, were bitter memories and complex emotions, which could not be discovered nor felt by others. 1. This was not the first time the word multifarious was used in connection with demons. Check out chapters 407 and 408. When Meng Hao looked at the statue of the demon that had his own face, his heart trembled. He could sense the grief within this demon, as well as an unyielding heart. There was also madness and hatred. Meng Hao quietly turned to look at the statue of the immortal. This statue also bore his face, a face tranquil, calm, and otherworldly. Its gaze seemed warm, but in truth, it was incredibly cold. It was as if, in its eyes, everything in heaven and earth could be expressed in terms of natural law, as if this immortal were above everything and everyone, the only immortal in the world. All memories, everything about the past, were like impurities from former lives. Everything that happened while treading the path of immortality would be left behind, severed, not allowed to be a hindrance or restraint of any kind. This immortal was neither ruthless nor sentimental. He was neither selfish nor selfless. There was only a certain separation from the past, as if, when looking back and recalling old memories, he was unaffected and would merely sigh lightly. Once again, the ancient voice echoed out. There is no need to speak your answer out loud. As long as it exists in your heart, that is enough. Expand. No one except for Meng Hao knew whether he had picked the demon or the immortal. Upon awakening, he found that several months had passed. He was currently back on the sun, and his paragon puppet was sitting cross-legged next to him, acting as Dharma protector. The surrounding 100,000 cultivators were operating the spell formation alone, and off in the distance, the flames of war flickered brightly on the first mountain. The outsiders had fought their way nearly to the peak of the mountain, and the overall state of the battle was one of incredible ferocity. Virtually all of the mountain and sea lords were out in the starry sky, fighting. Paragon Sea Dream was also there, and her eyes flashed like lightning as she observed the battle. The first mountain was on the verge of being overrun. There were no longer 6 outsider imperial lords. 2 had been killed, cut down by Grandpa Ming by means of the sun. However, he hadn't used 2 arrows to accomplish that, but 4. The sun currently had only 7 light arrows left to unleash. Of the 4 remaining imperial lords, 2 were currently participating in the battle. However, they weren't unleashing widespread destruction upon the mountain and sea cultivators. Instead, they acted like sharp blades, cutting open paths for the other outsiders to pour into the first mountain. They were skirting Sea Dream's bottom line, but weren't crossing it. They were well aware of that, and knew that as long as they didn't cross that bottom line, then the paragons wouldn't join in on the fighting. Unfortunately, without the help of a paragon, the mountain and sea lords were no match for the 2 imperial lords, not without teaming up, and even then they would have a hard time keeping them under control. Out in the starry sky, the final division of outsiders was arrayed in ranks, waiting to join the battle, eyes flickering with killing intent as they stared at the mountain and sea realm. The fighting had proceeded in this fashion for more than 7 months. In another 5 months, the 7th heaven and the other heavens would emerge from their current state and could join the fighting. When Meng Hao opened his eyes, everything was blurry at first. However, the sound of the battle being fought helped him to focus his thoughts, and soon his eyes glittered with bright light as he rose to his feet. Of the surrounding 100,000 cultivators, roughly half had fought with him in the earlier battle against Paragon Chu and Fang. When Meng Hao stood up, those cultivators looked over with eyes that burned passionately. The Crown Prince has awakened. The Crown Prince is awake. The 100,000 cultivators' loud cries echoed out in all directions, and soon, the entire sun was glowing even more brightly than before. There were even many cultivators fighting on the first mountain who could tell that a new pair of eyes had turned in their direction. As Meng Hao rose to his feet, countless images flashed through his mind of the events leading up to him losing consciousness. He also remembered an ancient voice speaking out in the moment before his vision had gone completely black. That voice seemed to contain all of the ancientness of the entire world. Who was he? He thought. Looking down at himself, he saw that the aura of death was gone and that his wounds were healed. He was even a bit stronger than before. Based on his cultivation base, his battle prowess was now such that he exceeded an imperial lord. He could definitely fight paragons now. The sensation of being in control of so much power caused Meng Hao to gasp. When he thought back to the insane battle with Xianxia, he couldn't dispel the lingering fear within his heart. His choice to extinguish 4 soul lamps had been a deranged decision that could have only been made in the face of certain death. He sent his divine sense sweeping out across the battlefield, and then the sun blazed with light as an arrow shot out toward the first mountain. Before any of the fighters on either side could react, that arrow stabbed into the head of one of the imperial lords. The sun's light arrows could injure even paragons, let alone imperial lords. This was not the first imperial lord to be killed by such an arrow. The sudden fatality shook the battlefield and was a message to all of the outsiders that Meng Hao was back. The outsider paragon from the 6th heaven was sitting cross-legged out in the starry sky. During the past months, he had been working hard at unraveling Meng Hao's essence of space and was on the verge of freeing Xianxia. Suddenly, his eyes opened, and when he looked at the mountain and sea realm, he caught sight of Meng Hao. He instantly frowned. During the course of working to breaking through the essence of space, he had confirmed that Meng Hao wasn't dead, but he had never imagined that he would make his comeback so soon. Only a few months ago, he had been hovering on the brink of death, and yet now he was fully recovered and even stronger than before. The instant Meng Hao woke up, the sun blazed dazzlingly, and an outsider imperial lord was killed. The army of outsiders was shaken, but their killing intent was as strong as ever. Furthermore, the first mountain was already completely soaked in blood. Meng Hao didn't unleash the power of the sun again. Even as he stood there, Sea Dream looked over at him with flashing eyes, and then suddenly her voice spoke in his mind. Send the paragon puppet to attack. Meng Hao's eyes glittered. He knew exactly what Sea Dream wanted to happen, so without any hesitation, he sent out his divine will, causing the paragon puppet's eyes to open. It instantly rose to its feet, eyes blazing as it took a step forward and then shot toward the first mountain. The mountain and sea realm was breaking the agreement that had been put in place. They were attacking with a paragon. Almost in the same moment that the paragon puppet began to move forward, the outsider paragon's face flickered, and he gnashed his teeth. He still needed more time to safely unravel the essence of space, and after all of the months that had passed, he still hadn't managed to take the first mountain. He knew that he was not a strategist, and that if Xianxia were here, the situation would be different. Now that Meng Hao was making a move in violation of the agreement, the outsider paragon gritted his teeth and then unleashed so much cultivation base power that he injured himself. His spirit turned listless as he coughed up his own life essence blood onto the essence of space seal. By using a secret magic and simultaneously drawing upon his longevity, he hoped to speed up the process of unraveling the seal. Rumbling could be heard as his life essence blood splashed onto Meng Hao's essence of space, which then shuddered and began to emit cracking sounds. Then, it simply collapsed. Xianxia shot out like lightning, and without even the slightest bit of hesitation, pointed his finger up at the 3rd heaven and unleashed all the power he could muster. The 3rd heaven began to tremble, then slowly tilted over and began to descend toward the mountain and sea realm. As of this moment, the balance which had been maintained over the past several months was completely disrupted. The reason Meng Hao was so important was not because of his control over the power of the sun, but rather that he could completely disrupt the balance that existed between the mountain and sea realm and the outsiders. In fact, Paragon Sea Dream had been waiting for months for Meng Hao to return, just for this express purpose. Once the Paragon puppet shot toward the first mountain, incredible pressure instantly exploded out from it. At the same time, the 3rd heaven began to pick up speed as it headed toward the mountain and sea realm. As for Paragon Xianxia, his hair was disheveled and his face ashen. Overall, he looked to be in very bad shape. A pained look could be seen in his eyes. During the months in which he had been trapped, The outsiders had lost their control over the flow of battle, and Xianfang knew that a critical moment had arrived. Mythdragon, help me. We've lost the initiative, and if we don't get it back, then this battle is lost. In response to his words, the paragon, wreathed in darkness, resolutely performed an incantation gesture and pointed up toward the land mass that was the third heaven. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the third heaven trembled, picking up even more speed as it headed toward the mountain and sea realm. At the same time, Xianfang didn't hesitate at all to send the fourth heaven into motion. Two land masses of enormous, indescribable size, both emitted ear-piercing rumbling sounds as they smashed down toward the mountain and sea realm. By that point, the paragon puppet had already set foot onto the first mountain. First, he clenched his hand into a fist and then punched out toward the army of outsiders. Heaven and earth shook, and screams rang out from the outsiders. Simultaneously, the two land masses were bearing down on the defenseless mountain and sea realm. The third heaven had already reached the former location of the destroyed first sea, and yet, for some reason, Paragon Sea Dream's expression hadn't changed at all. It was at this point that a cold snort suddenly echoed out from within the mountain and sea realm. A blue, illusory sea suddenly appeared over the first mountain, above which hovered an enormous violet gate. Written on that violet gate were 4 words: Nine Seas God World. Swirling beneath the gate were 100,000 sea dragons, which lifted the gate high up into the air. The sight was completely shocking and caused the eyes of the mountain and sea realm cultivators to grow wide. Cries of shock instantly began to ring out. It's the Nine Seas God World. The 3 great Taoist societies. Nine Seas God World is here. The 3 great Taoist societies are making a move. There were no sects or clans in the entire mountain and sea realm who could compare to the 3 great Taoist societies. Some groups could rival their power in an individual mountain and sea, but the 3 great Taoist societies existed in all of the 9 mountains and seas. When they combined their forces, then they truly deserved to be called the most powerful sects in the mountain and sea realm. Perhaps their cultivators weren't the most powerful, but they had been building up resources for countless years, storing up precious treasures which were now about to be unleashed. In fact, as soon as the Nine Seas God World gate appeared, it opened, and 18 coffins appeared. Magical symbols glittered on the surfaces of the coffins, and as they flew out, they transformed into 18 beams of light that sped toward the third heaven. As they flew along, the coffins began to crack and crumble, revealing 18 corpses. As the corpses appeared, their eyes opened, and they erupted with boundless cultivation, base power, and divine sense. Demonic cultivators of the lower realms, how dare ye? My life was dedicated to defending against the lower realms, demonic cultivators. How dare ye provoke the immortal world? Back down! As the enraged corpses shouted out, the power that erupted from them was the power of imperial lords. Shockingly, these were 18 imperial lords from the immortal world of yesteryear. Meng Hao was completely shaken, but was quickly able to determine that these corpses, despite having the power of imperial lords, were only the remnants of imperial lords who, in the moments before dying, allowed their discarnate souls to be turned into puppets, all for the purpose of unleashing one final attack. Once they made that attack, their souls would disperse for all eternity. The mountain and sea realm's resources and tactics are being revealed one by one, he thought. As he looked out at the mountain and sea realm, he realized that at this point in the battle, all the cards were being played. Chapter 1365. The Taoist Societies Make a Move. Chapter 1366. Advancing the Decisive Battle. Out in the starry sky, the 2 outsider paragons, Xianfang and Mythdragon, looked shocked. Mythdragon was hesitating, but Xianfang merely sighed, and a cold gleam appeared in his eyes as he pointed a finger up toward the land mass that was the 5th heaven. Fellow Taoist Mythdragon, please lend me a hand once more. Mythdragon sighed within his cloak of darkness. Fine, I'm useless when it comes to strategy. Just tell me what to do. With that, he rotated his cultivation base, whereupon a faint roar like that of a dragon echoed out. At the same time, numerous faint, shadowy forms appeared and began to swirl around him as he helped Xianfang set the 5th heaven in motion. The huge land mass that was the 5th heaven emitted enormous rumbling sounds, and then began to crush down toward the mountain and sea realm. Meanwhile, the power of the 18 imperial lord corpses was erupting out. Their discarnate souls were burning away, allowing incredible power of heaven and earth to be directed toward the third heaven. Massive rumbling sounds echoed out, and brilliant colors flashed. Cracks began to spread out across the third heaven, and soon it began to crumble and collapse. The 18 corpses transformed into 18 beams of blade-like light that shot toward the fourth heaven. Shockingly, as they closed in on the landmass that was the fourth heaven, they chose to self-detonate. BO1 The 18 corpses used the last bit of life force they had to explode. The starry sky vibrated and the fourth heaven, unable to avoid the blast, was hit head-on. In the blink of an eye, the entire landmass crumbled. Unable to maintain a solid form, it shattered and then transformed into smoke and ash. Even as the crumbling fragments of the third heaven continued to fall down toward the mountain and sea realm, several beams of sword light suddenly appeared from down below. Suddenly, 9 swords shot out from within the mountain and sea realm. Converged upon those 9 swords was the wills of the cultivators of the sublime flow sword grotto of their respective mountain and sea. Precious treasures from the paragon immortal realm, they slashed out toward the fragments of the third heaven, completely destroying them. The brilliant sword light, which filled the mountain and sea realm, caused everything else to grow dark. Meng Hao still stood there on the sun, watching as all of this happened, his heart pounding with excitement. At the same time, the land mass that was the fifth heaven was still under the control of Xianxia and Mithragan as it smashed down toward the mountain and sea realm. We need to force the mountain and sea realm to pull out everything they have. The seventh heaven and above can't join the battle, but they can see what's happening. Xianxia's eyes glittered as he drew upon all of his cultivation base to send the fifth heaven in after the third and fourth heaven. The fifth heaven was far larger than all the previous heavens, and as soon as it began to descend, the starry sky was crushed. Massive rifts snaked out everywhere, and yet at the same time, an old man suddenly flew out from the first mountain. That old man had the demeanor of a transcendent being, but if you looked closely, you would see that he was actually transparent. He was illusory and not real. Even as he appeared, the sound of scriptures being chanted could be heard echoing out from the immortal ancient Taoist rite temples in the 9 mountains of the mountain and sea realm. The chanting filled the entire mountain and sea realm, and a strange power rose up, almost like a summoning. Apparently, it was that illusory old man who was being summoned. Meng Hao instantly recognized him. It was the same old man who had given sermons on the Tao back when he himself had been in that abandoned temple of the immortal ancient Taoist rite. The same man who could write the character immortal Chinese letter into the air with his finger. Now that old man floated out into the void as if he had been transported from ancient times into the present. Mixed emotions could be seen on his face, and he sighed as he extended his hand, pushing it toward the incoming fifth heaven. That simple motion caused the entire fifth heaven land mass to shudder to a stop. Then, to Meng Hao's complete disbelief, the entire land mass began to dissolve, transforming into nothing more than ash. It happened too quickly for anyone to even react. A simple gesture by that old man caused the land mass that was the fifth heaven to completely vanish. Then the figure of the old man began to fade away. At the same time, countless cultivators in the immortal ancient Taoist rite temples in the mountain and sea realm coughed up blood, the price that they had to pay for the summoning. Imperial Lord corpses, deadly Tao realm treasures, paragon projections. The mountain and sea realm's resources run incredibly deep. Xianxia stared at the disappearing old man from the immortal ancient Taoist rite, then took a deep breath, whereupon his eyes flickered with a gleam of madness. We won't be able to drag this fight out until the seventh heaven and the others arrive. Fellow Taoist Mithragan, as of this moment, we have only one choice. Put everything on the line, lest the both of us perish this day. Xianxia rose to his feet, then looked in the direction of the sixth heaven and stamped his foot down viciously. Instantly, the sixth heaven began to tilt onto its side. Paragon Mithragan stood there silently, sighing. He knew that the battle had been lost and that it was because of him. Therefore, without any hesitation, he also stamped his foot down, his eyes flickering with killing intent. The land mass that was the sixth heaven emitted rumbling sounds, as it slowly began to move toward the mountain and sea realm. The combined power unleashed by 5 of our land masses is not enough to break through even their first line of defense, said Xianxia. Based on the resources the mountain and sea realm has at hand, we aren't well enough prepared to win. However, I refuse to only use part of what we have at our disposal. Fellow Taoist Mithragan, we must hold nothing back. Let us see. If we can break through this line of defense, let us see if the mountain and sea realm has any tricks left to defend themselves. The more resources they draw on now, the easier it will be for the seventh heaven and the others to prepare to counter them in the months to come. That will lead to the mountain and sea realm being defeated in even more expeditious fashion. Fang's eyes glittered coldly as he and Mythdragon sent the sixth heaven barreling toward the mountain and sea realm. At the same time, the final division of millions of outsiders followed the directions imparted by Fang's divine will, surrounding the sixth heaven, joining it to crash into the mountain and sea realm. The decisive battle was being fought ahead of schedule. It only took a moment for the mountain and sea realm to brace itself. Even as the sixth heaven began to descend, the 100,000 sea dragons beneath the nine seas god world gate roared and flew up to meet it. However, as they closed in, killing intent flickered within the eyes of Paragon Mythdragon of the sixth heaven. He waved his right hand viciously through the air, and the howl of a dragon could be heard coming from the darkness which surrounded him. Suddenly, an evil, pitch-black dragon roared out, fully 30,000 meters long. Its appearance instantly caused heaven and earth to shake violently, and elicited a howl of rage from the 100,000 sea dragons. The explosive roaring sounds caused everything to shake, and at the same time, Paragon Mythdragon erupted with Paragon power. After all, despite not being adept at strategy, he was very adept at slaughter. As soon as he waved his hand, the roaring of the evil black dragon caused the sea dragons to begin to tremble. In the blink of an eye, their flesh was flayed off of their bodies, and they were transformed into bones, which then collapsed into ash. The black, evil dragon then shot toward the gate of the nine seas god world. However, it was at this point that the gate suddenly slammed open, and an enormous 30,000-meter sea dragon flew out. This sea dragon had no flesh and was made completely of bone. As soon as it flew out, the shattered bits of flesh and blood from the other sea dragons, as well as the ash from their bones, instantly flew over to cover the bones of the gigantic sea dragon. Now that it had a body of flesh and blood, it charged toward the evil dragon, roaring. At this point, Paragon Sea Dream flew out to join the Paragon puppet, which was still under Meng Hao's control. Meng Hao also sped out of the sun and headed toward the battlefield. The 9 swords from the Sublime Flow Sword Grotto then ripped through the void toward the sixth heaven landmass. Further in the depths of the mountain and sea realm, the sound of chanting scriptures once again rose up from the immortal ancient Taoist rite. This time, a middle-aged man appeared out of thin air. His eyes were blank, and he held a long spear in his hand. He instantly stepped forward and began to slaughter the outsiders. At the same time, Paragon Mythdragon took a step forward, transforming into 3 incarnations, one of which headed toward Paragon Sea Dream and the other toward the Paragon puppet. The last incarnation became a black beam of light that sped toward the 9 swords. The black light around him shattered, transforming into a hail of shrapnel that spiraled toward the 9 swords, then reformed into a sealing field which trapped them. Without the black light cloaking him, Paragon Mythdragon was now revealed for all to see. He was huge, with 3 heads, 2 of which had their eyes closed. The eyes of the middle head glowed with bright red light as he stared toward the middle-aged man whom the immortal ancient Taoist rite had summoned. Soon, the glow of magical techniques rose up into the sky. As all of that was happening, Fang began to pick up speed as he headed toward Meng Hao. With all the main powerhouses of the mountain and sea realm locked down, there was no way to stop the sixth heaven. A massive boom echoed out as it slammed into the first mountain. The mountain trembled, and cracking sounds emanated out as crevices were ripped open. Then, the land mass continued to smash down into the first mountain until it was completely obliterated. By this point, most of the land mass that was the sixth heaven was destroyed. Endless amounts of rubble then began to rain destructively toward the rest of the mountain and sea realm. Instantly, the spell formations of the second sea were activated, causing the second sea to collapse as it blocked the falling rubble. Mountains were being crushed, and seas were being obliterated. Even as the second sea collapsed to block the rubble raining down, Siddhagarbha was sitting cross-legged on the moon. When his eyes opened, they glowed with icy coldness, and he immediately activated the defensive shield, despite the injuries inflicted upon himself by doing so. A glittering shield appeared above the second mountain, upon which smashed the remnants of the falling rubble, which then turned into ash. No further destruction was carried out. The danger posed by the sixth heaven was neutralized. "That's it," Fang said, sighing. Behind him, the final division of outsiders was charging into the mountain and sea cultivators. Instantly, fierce fighting broke out. At the same time, complete silence filled everything behind the second mountain. No more special methods or techniques were unleashed. Still don't feel the need to use more of their reserves. Well, in that case, Fang performed an incantation gesture with his right hand and pointed in Meng Hao's direction. However, just when Meng Hao was about to make a move, Fang pulled back, laughing. I don't care what methods the seventh heaven or all the other heavens have at their disposal, they're not going to be here anytime soon. Therefore, since the mountains and seas won't reveal any of its other resources then, this kid and that sun and moon must be destroyed. Activate the immortal imprisoning formation. Chapter 1367, No Choice But to Descend. As soon as the words left Fang's mouth, glittering light appeared on the previously obscured seventh heaven, and then the eighth and the ninth, all the way to the 33rd heaven. There were still several more months left before they could unbind themselves from their current state. However, they could hear the words uttered by Fang, and could also see everything clearly. In fact, they had been closely observing the battle as it played out over the past few months, and had already begun preparing special ways to deal with the mountain and sea realm based on what they had seen. Also, they had long since come to the realization of how important the sun and moon were. From what they could tell, the most important between the two was not the sun, but the moon. Of course, with Meng Hao in position on the sun, considering his battle prowess and the fact that he controlled a paragon puppet, he was now fully qualified to tie down two paragons in battle. A mountain and sea cultivator like that was someone the 33 heavens couldn't afford to disregard, and they had long since placed him on their list of priority targets to kill. After hearing Fang's declaration, the powerful outsider experts from the 7th to the 33rd heaven, including the two 8 essences paragons, were all completely focused on how things were playing out. Whether it was because of the effort to kill Meng Hao and K. Siddhagarbha, for the overall strategy of drawing out the battle, or even more importantly, for the safety of Fang and Mithragan, what was happening now was of utmost importance. That was also why Fang had taken immediate, seemingly maddened action after being unsealed. Attacking with all the land masses ensured that he had nowhere to retreat to. Thus, the forces which remained from the 33 heavens would not hesitate to do everything they could to come to his aid. Only then could this battle not be called a complete failure for him. As long as I can destroy the sun or the moon, then, this battle won't have been a total failure. The starry sky then began to tremble as a beam of light emerged from the main force of the 33 heavens, which then shot down toward the mountain and sea realm. It moved with incredible speed, and yet, even as it neared, another beam of light rose up from the 9th mountain. Those two beams of light shot toward each other, and then collided outside of the mountain and sea realm. As rumbling booms echoed out, an enraged roar echoed out from the 33 heavens. That light which shot down was blasted into countless shards of light, which were now incapable of forming the immortal imprisoning formation Fang had spoken of. At the same time, large numbers of cultivators poured out from the second mountain to charge into the outsiders, and began to fight bitterly. Paragon Mithragan simultaneously began to fight the Paragon puppet, Paragon Sea Dream, and the 9 Seas God World Sea Dragon. He was also keeping the Sublime Flow Sword Grotto at bay, and was even pinning down the middle-aged man from the immortal ancient Taoist rite. Of course, he paid a heavy price to do all of that as, almost instantly, blood sprayed out of his mouth. And yet he didn't back down. Grinning viciously, he slapped his hand onto his head. A boom rang out as black light erupted out from him, causing his battle prowess, and that of all his incarnations, to leap to new heights. Dragondom and Tyrant Physique, said Paragon Sea Dream, her eyes flashing. That's an innate divine ability of the Mithragan clan, which allows a battle soul to possess the body, making it impervious to divine abilities and magical techniques. However, once the Tyrant Physique ends, all the wounds he seemingly avoided will suddenly flare up. That means he's seeking to die in battle. His delays led to their defeat, so he's going to put his life on the line. Off in the distance, Paragon Fang saw what was happening, and after a moment of silence, threw his head back and laughed. Eyes flickering with determination, he shot toward Meng Hao. As for Meng Hao, his eyes glittered, and instead of backing up, he advanced, and soon the two of them were battling back and forth with booming divine abilities. Meng Hao was in a slightly inferior position. His cultivation base qualified him to fight with paragons, but not necessarily to win. However, delaying Fang was nothing difficult. As long as Mithragan was forced to retreat or even killed by the various methods employed by everyone he was fighting, then Fang would destined to fall in this battle. Of you two paragons, one will definitely die here, Meng Hao said coolly, his eyes flickering with killing intent. This was not his first time fighting Xianfang, and in their last battle he had been pushed to the very limit. But now he had fully recovered and was even stronger in terms of battle prowess. Booms rang out from within the army of outsiders, as well as screams. The mountain and sea cultivators were unleashing carnage, and their numbers were swelling as more cultivators joined in the battle. The outsiders, second to the sixth heavens, had actually done a great deal more damage to the mountain and sea realm structure than the first heaven had. However, in terms of the casualties they were wreaking upon the mountain and sea cultivators, it didn't match up at all. Meanwhile, the forces in the 7th to the 33rd heavens up above could sense what danger Xianfang and Mythdragon were in. Roars of rage echoed out as they attempted to extricate themselves from their current state. However, that state was like a double-edged sword. Although it had enabled them to escape catastrophe from the sudden attack of the mountain and sea realm, it also left them completely and utterly sealed. In the final analysis, they had never anticipated that the combined power of 5 land masses couldn't even break through the second line of defense in the mountain and sea realm. Furthermore, they were losing so badly in the battle below that they were virtually being massacred. Booms rang out as the 7th through 33rd heavens all bashed against the invisible ceiling barrier. On the battlefield, the mountain and sea realm clearly had the advantage, and the outsiders were dying in droves. They were shoved back again and again, and seemed incapable of fighting back against the mountain and sea cultivators. In front of the second mountain, the second sea had collapsed, and in its place was a sea of blood. As for Paragon Mythdragon, after utilizing his body technique, he was going all out. However, his heart was filled with bitterness because of the failure of the immortal imprisoning formation. Had it succeeded, he would not be in such a bad situation. He currently had all of the top experts of the mountains and seas locked down, but the price was that he himself was stuck in an unimaginably deadly situation. Xianfang, hurry up, Mythdragon roared. Xianfang was already going all out with his cultivation base. Paragon power erupted out, and yet he was unable to break free from the fight. Not only had he been weakened, Meng Hao had already fought a deadly battle with him before. Meng Hao was used to his fighting tactics, and therefore, breaking free from the fight was not something that Xianfang could do quickly. No matter what he tried to do, he simply couldn't get away. Meng Hao transformed into an azure rock, which whistled through the starry sky, slashing its deadly talons out in attack. He used the one-thought stellar transformation, as well as his supernova magic. He even unleashed his demon sealing hexing magic, and the backlash wasn't as bad as it had been in the past. At the moment, the 2 outsider paragons could not flee, and there was no one there to save them. The 7th through 33rd heavens were getting very anxious. If things kept going as they were, then they needed to be prepared for one of their paragons to perish. The 33 heavens originally had 5 paragons. Igu was essentially dead. If they lost another, they might still be able to secure a victory, but the price would be one they were hard-pressed to pay. //. Currently, Shui Dongliu was on planet South Heaven, outside the 9th mountain, looking up coldly into the starry sky. He appeared to be hesitating, as if he had a very hard decision to make. After a long moment, he murmured, "If you take a step back, you realize that there is no one who cannot be sacrificed, even me, since that's the case." He took a deep breath and then slowly lowered his hand. "Since that's the case, I will allow you people to open a breach ahead of schedule. That way, you'll be able to send someone in. However, the price you will pay is that the overall time before the rest of you can emerge from the sealed state will be extended. Most importantly, those 2 experts who were possessed by the 2 powerful forces, they who now have the power of 8 essences paragons, will be unable to descend before the seal is completely removed. This will make things very dangerous for Ksitigarbha, Sea Dream, and the 3 great Taoist societies. It will be even more dangerous for Meng Hao." After a long, thoughtful moment, Shui Dongliu sighed. "In the end, the 33 heavens don't count for much. It is those 2 possessed paragons, who are the powerful enemies we can't handle right now." Outside of the second mountain, intense fighting was going on. Mythdragon was suffering successive defeats and didn't seem like he could hang on much longer. He had already used the body technique multiple times and was now on the verge of collapsing. Xianfang could do nothing to push Meng Hao away and break free, and was getting more and more anxious. However, it was at this point that a huge boom echoed out in the starry sky. It was hard to say what price had been paid by the 7th to 33rd heavens, but suddenly, everything from the 16th heaven and below started to flicker, as if the sealing power were becoming unstable. Then, bright lights flashed as the 7th through 16th heavens suddenly materialized in the starry sky. Apparently, the 17th heaven and above had taken on the sealing power, which had been restraining the 7th through 16th heavens, allowing those heavens to break free. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the 7th heaven descended, followed by the 8th, the 9th, all the way to the 16th heaven. In total, 10 heavens rumbled down out of the starry sky toward the mountain and sea realm. At the same time, 10 beams of light shot out from those land masses, causing rumbling sounds to echo out as they closed in on the mountain and sea realm. One of those beams of light shot toward Mithragan, instantly ending his battle with the mountain and sea experts and dragging him away. The second beam of light burst onto the scene of Meng Hao and Chuan Fang's battle, creating a huge wave of qi that separated the two of them. Meng Hao was violently shoved backward toward the mountain and sea realm's sun. Even as blood oozed out of the corners of his mouth, the fourth beam of light shot with incredible speed toward the sun. There was nothing Meng Hao could do except watch as the beam of light slammed into the sun, instantly transforming 100,000 cultivators into ash. As for the sun, it began to tremble, and then fissures spread out across its surface in completely shocking fashion. Chapter 1368, Reversals. Meng Hao's eyes went wide at the shocking scene, and he let out a miserable howl. N-O-O-O. At the same time, the fifth beam of light shot toward the moon. Of course, the moon was designed for defense, so although it was shaken, and the 100,000 cultivators there coughed up blood and withered dangerously, they didn't die. Cracking sounds emanated out as crevices opened up all over the moon. It appeared to be on the verge of imminent collapse. Next, the remaining 5 beams of light spread out to cover the entire mountain and sea realm as a whole. They weren't being used as an attack, but rather as a seal. Powerful rumbling echoed out. Heaven and earth trembled. The starry sky went dim. Sea Dream and the others felt their faces fall as the 5 beams of light covered the whole mountain and sea realm, cutting it off completely from the sun and the moon. As of this moment, the sun and the moon were now outside of the mountain and sea realm. The development occurred so quickly that all Meng Hao could do was laugh bitterly at the realization that this was simply how war worked. Life was the weakest of all things in a war and could be snuffed out in a single attack. Of the 100,000 cultivators who had been stationed on the sun, half had paid a heavy price to help him buy time in his earlier battle with Xuan Fang. They and Meng Hao were comrades in arms. Meng Hao's eyes were bright red, and yet he had no time to ponder the matter at the moment. Even as the 5 beams of light formed together into the huge seal, Meng Hao sent divine will out to his paragon puppet. Instantly, it performed a teleportation, bursting out from within the seal to appear at his side. At the same time, tens of millions of outsiders poured out from the 7th to 16th heavens, along with countless vicious-looking war chariots. The 7th through 16th heavens were like an inverted pagoda, whose converged force caused intense pressure to weigh down through the starry sky. It was almost as if a gigantic, invisible hand were crushing down onto the mountain and sea realm, causing all of the mountains, seas, and planets to tremble. The 5 beams of light which had shot out from the 10 land masses were like a huge cage, trapping everything from the 2nd mountain to the 9th mountain, completely separating them. They were now isolated, impossible to aid, a sudden change that caused the faces of the mountain and sea cultivators to fall. Mixed emotions could be seen on Sea Dream's face as she tried in vain to break past the barrier. For the time being, the 3 great Taoist societies' efforts were for naught. Although the mountain and sea realm would be temporarily shielded from any attacks, Meng Hao and K. Siddhagarbha were now completely isolated in a dangerous situation. The sun and the moon had been of incredible aid throughout the war, and the 33 heavens could sense how threatening they were. Now, they had descended with the intent of destroying that very sun and moon at any price. Meng Hao fell back into the sun's spell formation. He was completely alone, not even corpses had been left behind. The only thing that existed was a pervasive aura of death, and the souls of the dead, which refused to disperse. Meng Hao sat there silently, and his eyes began to glow with intense killing intent. As the paragon puppet appeared next to him on the sun, he looked off into the distance at the waves of tens of millions of outsiders swarming out from the 10 land masses. Even as they began to fill the starry sky, Xuan Fang and Mithragan were retreating into the outsider army. Xuan Fang was in slightly better condition, whereas Mithragan was a mass of blood and wounds. He was clearly severely wounded and could barely stand. Even as he consumed medicinal pills, several imperial lords helped him to return to the land masses to recover. He was so grievously injured that he could barely maintain consciousness. After finally reaching the 16th landmass, he coughed up a mouthful of blood and then closed his eyes in meditation, surrounded by outsider guards. It wasn't that he didn't notice Meng Hao's murderous gaze coming all the way from the sun. Instead, he didn't deign to care. Although Meng Hao was powerful enough to arouse his caution, in the current situation, Meng Hao had to consider his own survival, and thus Paragon Mythdragon didn't pay him any heed. Paragon Chuan Fang threw his head back and laughed uproariously. Inwardly, he was elated at what had occurred. 10 land masses had appeared, and tens of millions of outsider reinforcements had arrived, including 10 imperial lords, although there were no paragons as far as Chuan Fang was concerned. The current reinforcements were enough. It's enough for me to destroy the sun and moon, and then at least half of the rest of the mountain and sea realm. It's also plenty to be able to last until the 17th heaven and the others arrive. Eyes flickering with killing intent, Xuan Fang reached his hand out toward the moon and pointed. Imperial lords, destroy that moon and all the cultivators on it. Even as the words left his mouth, the newly arrived Imperial lords shot toward the moon with bursting energy and murderous auras. They were joined by a force of millions of outsiders, all of whom charged toward the moon. On the moon itself, Kesidigarbha's face returned to its normal placid state. He even began to chuckle, although it was a hoarse, pained chuckle. However, the burning fire in his eyes had not lessened. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes, and as for the 100,000 cultivators who surrounded him, despite their withered state, in which they hovered on the edge of death like candles flickering in the wind, none of them said a word. They looked down in the direction of the mountain and sea realm, clearly reluctant to part from it into death, and yet at the same time sending it their well wishes. Then the 100,000 cultivators closed their eyes, appearing to give the last bits of their life force as a sacrifice to the mountain and sea realm. As they fueled the defensive powers of the moon, rumbling sounds echoed out, and numerous beams of light appeared to completely surround the moon. As they did, the divine abilities of the outsider imperial lords, as well as the magical techniques of the millions of other outsiders, bore down and seemed to be on the verge of completely engulfing the moon. Blood oozed out of the eyes, ears, noses, and mouths of the 100,000 cultivators, and their bones began to shatter. Kesidigarbha continued to chuckle bitterly, and yet a look of increasing madness was seeping into his eyes. On the other side of the field of battle, Xuan Fang was eyeing the sun with killing intent. He had already fought Meng Hao twice. The first time had been an incredibly bitter fight. The second fight had gone on for longer, and yet wasn't as bitter. However, because of Meng Hao, he had been unable to rescue Mythdragon, who had ended up being trapped in an incredibly dangerous situation. Our third battle. This time either you die or I die. Flicking his sleeve, Xuan Fang sent out divine will instructions to the surrounding millions of outsiders, whereupon all of them charged toward the sun, radiating intensely murderous auras. Paragon Xuan Fang followed behind them, performing a double-handed incantation gesture that caused some strange magical technique to begin to build up. Meng Hao sat there silently. He had not possessed the initiative during this battle, which did not conform to his personality. His eyes flickered, and he sent divine will out to the paragon puppet, which instantly stood up, killing intent flickering in its eyes. It took a step forward, shot toward Xuan Fang, but then unexpectedly passed by him and headed toward the main group of the outsider army behind him. And then it kept going in the direction of the 16th heaven. Its goal, Meng Hao's goal, was the heavily wounded paragon Mythdragon. You want to kill me? How about I kill your paragon? As Meng Hao sat there cross-legged within the spell formation, he looked at Xuan Fang, eyes ice-cold as he said, "Are you going to save him or not?" At the same time, rumbling sounds could be heard from within the mountain and sea realm, as an intense power rose up from within the 9th mountain, which shot up toward the seal covering the mountain and sea realm. When it slammed into the seal twisted and distorted, sending brilliant light shining out. At the same time, Paragon Sea Dream and the 3 great Taoist societies all attacked. And yet, something else happened at the same time. Within the mountain and sea realm were 3 temples out in the starry sky, temples that no one could see. Within each of those temples were an old man and a young man. Right now, those old men were opening their eyes, almost as if they had been summoned, as if orders had been delivered to them. Take my magical item and assist the masses to break that seal open. The exact same words came out of the mouths of all 3 old men, and as they echoed out into the temples, the young men looked up, their eyes flickering with the desire to do battle. They had been waiting for this war for a very long time. Rumbling sounds could be heard as the young man in the first temple looked up, and a suit of blue armor spread out over his body, covering even his face. A long blue spear materialized in front of him, which he grasped. As he did, an intense energy surged up from him. It quickly reached the 6 essences level, and then a bit higher than that, although that energy didn't seem to come from the young man himself, but rather from the suit of armor and the spear. He took a step forward, suddenly appearing outside of the temple, where he became a blue streak of light that shot up toward the seal. At the same time, in the other 2 temples, other streaks of light appeared. One was crimson, and inside of it was a figure in blood-red armor, with a blood-colored sword and a colossal murderous aura. In another direction was a bright yellow beam of light, within which was a figure wearing bright yellow armor. In that figure's hand was a bamboo scroll. Shocking divine scents swirled around him as he flew up with incredible speed. Booms rang out as these 3 figures smashed into the shield. Astonishingly, these 3 figures were emitting 3 different auras, that of the Sublime Spirit Scripture, the Tao Divinity Scripture, and the Heaven-Severing Scripture. The 3 classic scriptures of the mountain and sea realm were all in play. The seal shook violently, and cracking sounds rang out as if it might collapse at any moment. Within the mountain and sea realm was another figure who was violently headbutting the seal. It was none other than Patriarch Reliance. Back when the mountain and sea realm had entered its siege mode, he had disappeared somewhere. Now he suddenly reappeared, and as he battered the seal, he muttered, "That little bastard most likely isn't dead. If he really was, then I would be free, but I still feel like having him alive is a bit better." Sighing, he bashed into the seal again. /expand. At the same time, all of the cultivators in the mountain and sea realm unleashed their divine abilities to batter against the seal, which began to weaken and crack. However, the 33 heavens had paid an incredible price to put this seal in place. It was clearly something extraordinary in nature. Despite cracking, it did not fall. Outside of the mountain and sea realm, booming sounds echoed out from the moon as the imperial lords and the other outsiders attacked it relentlessly. The moon quivered on the verge of being destroyed, causing Chu and Fang to begin to laugh coldly and completely ignore the paragon puppet, which was slaughtering its way toward the 16th heaven. Instead, he stood in place, both hands flashing in incantation gestures as a bizarre aura built up around him. Soon, countless illusory figures became visible in his vicinity. As that happened, the divine abilities of millions of outsiders descended onto the sun like a sea of magic, engulfing it. The sun did not have the defensive powers that the moon did, so as soon as the sea of magic hit it, it began to crack and split. The entire sun seemed to be on the very brink of collapsing. There in the midst of the sea of magic was Meng Hao, who began to laugh in the face of the terrifying attack. His eyes burned with fire because he knew that this attack was something the sun could not withstand. It would be broken. It was all thanks to the terrifying beam of light which had struck it. That grievous blow ensured that the sun was now incapable of surviving for much longer. Since that's the case, instead of simply letting you destroy this sun, I should use it to kill more of you outsiders. Meng Hao threw both hands up and then slammed them down onto the surface of the sun. The blow was backed by the rotation of his cultivation base and the power of his fleshly body, and the impact caused the sun to tremble, then suddenly explode into pieces. BO1MM. Shrapnel that was the remnants of the sun exploded out in all directions, creating a powerful attack that slammed into the sea of magic. When those 2 forces collided, a terrifying shockwave blasted out into the starry sky. It was like the roar of a giant as dazzling light shot out everywhere. The whole scene resembled a destructive apocalypse. As the light and heat of the sun's self-detonation spread out, the sea of magic was enveloped. The millions of outsiders were powerful, but the destructive power of the sun was something they simply couldn't fight against. After all, this sun had illuminated the mountain and sea realm for tens upon tens of thousands of years. Considering it had heated the realm for so long, it was impossible to even imagine how hot it was. Most important was that the sun had actually been created from a treasure belonging to Paragon 9 seals. As such, its detonation was shocking beyond imagination. The massive sound of the explosion filled the heavens, and the dazzling light it created lit up everything. Everyone in the mountain and sea realm, and all of the outsiders beyond the area of the explosion, stared at what was happening in complete shock. The scene playing out in front of them could rightly be described as the most insane thing any of them had witnessed. The sun was exploding. BO1MM. The detonation was not something that just ended immediately. It was an ongoing process in which intense light and heat continuously blasted out in all directions. The sea of magic was completely engulfed, and the surrounding outsiders had no time to flee. They were swept over, their flesh and blood torn from their bodies as they were incinerated into ash. Because of the blinding light, some people simply closed their eyes. Others braved the piercing rays of light to watch. Countless miserable screams began to rise up as rank after rank of outsiders were wiped away, as if by an enormous hand of light. It was at this point that Paragon Xianfang finished his double-handed incantation. He looked up, and a callous smile could be seen on his face. He was the type of person who understood war, and although he would not dare to say that no one in existence could match up to him, he was certain that among the 5 great paragons, he was the most skilled strategist. In war there is only victory and defeat, he said coolly. There is no such thing as right or wrong. To gain victory, I am willing to sacrifice anything. If it comes down to it, I will even sacrifice myself. Since the spirit of the mountain and sea realm has risen up, then fate has been sealed. Either you people will die or us. Suddenly, he waved his finger in the direction of the masses of dead outsiders. Along with the wave of his finger came his voice, filled with a strange tone as it echoed out into the starry sky. Your souls are the spell, your blood is the sacrament. The world is vast, the stars are the expanse. Converge the will of severing into a blade. As his voice echoed out, countless screaming, vengeful souls rose up, which were the dead outsiders. Their blood, which should have been completely wiped away by the light and heat, now began to swirl up, merge together, and shine with a bizarre light. As for the blood which had already faded away, the odor of gore which it left behind rapidly transformed into an illusory sea of blood. Then the screaming outsider souls then sank down into the sea of blood, as if they were refusing to die. The bitter, venomous cries of the souls echoed out into all creation, as if they wanted to overturn the starry sky itself. The converged screams of millions of outsiders became the most intense of hatreds. Form your hatred into a blade and use that blade to sever all mental connections. Xianfang's voice boomed like thunder, and his expression was completely vicious as he raised his hand up into the air. As he did, the churning sea of blood formed together into the shape of a blade. A huge blade. A blade formed from endless hatred. Paragon Xianfang lifted the blade high up, and then slashed it down toward Meng Hao. Fellow Taoist Egu, today I shall help you be severed free. Even as Meng Hao looked up, he realized that the blade of hatred only seemed to be slashing toward him. Its real target was the space just in front of Meng Hao. There in front of Meng Hao was something that no one could see, and in fact he hadn't noticed up to this point. A thread. It was a thread that Xianfang could only see after employing a bizarre magical technique. It was the thread connecting Meng Hao to his paragon puppet. By means of that thread and by means of divine will, Meng Hao could control the paragon puppet. More importantly, that thread did not actually belong to Meng Hao himself, nor had he created it. It came from Chumentai. The blade was descending to sever that thread. If it succeeded, Meng Hao's divine will connection to his paragon puppet would be severed. The blood and souls of millions of outsiders had transformed into a blade, which had been Paragon Xianfang's plan all along. Although his actions had seemed to change arbitrarily, the truth was that everything had been done to try to gain the greatest possible advantage for the outsiders. His choice in this moment was not to try to cut down Meng Hao, but rather to sever that thread. In addition to gaining an advantage for the outsiders, it would also resolve the problem of the Paragon puppet trying to kill Paragon Mythdragon. A boom rang out, and Meng Hao's pupils constricted as he sensed the connection between him and the Paragon puppet being cut. Having control of the Paragon puppet suddenly taken away felt like having a limb severed. It was as if the sensation of control was still there, except that the limb was gone. At the same time, the Paragon puppet, which had been charging toward the 16th heaven, suddenly shuddered. Its eyes grew blank as it slowed down and stopped moving. A soul blade created from the souls of millions can sever all divine will. Meng Hao, without ego, you are doomed to die. Xianfang began to laugh uproariously. He had always believed himself to be shockingly adept at scheming, and this proved that he was right. His ability with scheming and strategy was truly causing incredible problems for the mountain and sea realm. Without him, the battle would have been much simpler, and the losses sustained by the mountain and sea realm would have been much more manageable. But now, the sun had exploded, and the moon was in grave danger. And yet after Meng Hao's eyes went wide for a moment, a strange expression appeared on his face. Paragon Xianfang loved to scheme and loved to come up with ideas and plans that no one could see through. Meng Hao already knew that. It was at this point that Meng Hao blinked and then cleared his throat. The thread had been created by Chumentai, and although Meng Hao wasn't completely sure of exactly how terrifyingly powerful Chumentai was, the mere fact that he could turn a paragon into a puppet showed that he was completely beyond the ordinary and definitely had other terrifying abilities at his disposal. The agreement with Chumentai had been that Meng Hao would have a paragon puppet, but now, the connection had been severed by someone else, and he had lost the puppet. Most important of all, Chumentai needed Meng Hao's willing aid to be the seed of hope which would lead to the return of his master. That was why, not only had Chumentai refrained from doing anything to harm Meng Hao's interests, he had also given him the puppet, not just to comply with their agreement, but also as a way to protect him. After all, Meng Hao's life or death had a lot to do with whether or not Chumentai would succeed or fail in awakening his master. And of course, Meng Hao was aware of all of that. As such, it was easy to imagine that the person who would be most incensed that the thread had been severed wouldn't be Meng Hao, but rather Chumentai. He might be slumbering, but he would definitely awaken because of something like that. It was at this point that Meng Hao said, "Chumentai, the thread was severed." Xuanfang's laughter continued to ring out as he began to advance toward Meng Hao. However, it was then that his face fell, and his heart suddenly trembled. He suddenly had a very bad premonition, a strange feeling in his heart that something disastrous was about to happen. At the same time, a voice suddenly rang out from the mouth of the motionless paragon puppet. "You really dare to sever the thread I created?" The paragon puppet suddenly turned, and its eyes were glowing bright red. It appeared to be completely and utterly enraged. As of this moment, this was not the paragon puppet, this was something which had been buried deep inside of the paragon puppet, a fragment of Chumentai's soul. His voice was filled with a murderous aura and echoed with madness. Few people could actually hear the voice, but Paragon Xuanfang could, and his eyes widened. Then his heart began to thump as he slowly turned to look at the paragon puppet. Then his face fell. Chapter 1369, Sun Detonate / Expand. In almost the same moment that the paragon puppet's eyes fell on Xuanfang, an indescribably shocking divine sense exploded out from it. The divine sense was not flexible but rigid. It was also boundlessly ancient. However, it was so majestic that Xuanfang couldn't help but gasp in disbelief. Meng Hao's eyes flickered in response to this change in the paragon puppet. At the same time, the power of the exploding sun was weakening after destroying millions of nearby outsiders. Because Meng Hao was in the middle of the spell formation, he wasn't hurt very much at all. Instead, his eyes glittered with killing intent as he looked in the direction of the 16th heaven, and then back at Xuanfang, whose face had completely fallen. It had been a long time since Meng Hao had conned anyone, although in truth, this was not a case of him conning Xuanfang, but more a case of Xuanfang setting himself up for failure. Meng Hao had always had his speculations regarding Chumentai's true level of power, and Xuanfang's actions now were only giving him a deeper understanding. The mountain and sea realm has so many mysterious entities. Chumentai, that old man on the boat, and also Slaughter who walked out of Dao Heaven's scroll painting. Then there's Shui Dongliu. Meng Hao's eyes flickered. He had the intense premonition that as the war reached its climax, as the 33 heavens and the mountain and sea realm headed closer and closer to the final battle, all of the secrets would be revealed, like a scroll being unfurled. And all of this? Who exactly are the enemies and who are the friends? And who was it that saved me before? Was it Shui Dongliu? What exactly are his plans here in the mountain and sea realm? Meng Hao sighed inwardly. After awakening from his coma, there had been no time to ask Paragon Sea Dream about such matters. However, he had long since developed the feeling that the truth about the mountain and sea realm was covered by a mist-like gauze, which made it impossible to see everything clearly. However, it seemed to him that there was someone behind the scenes influencing everything that was happening in the war. He himself was only a pawn in this war. Perhaps everyone was, including the outsiders. They were pawns with no idea who the chessmaster was. It was brutal, but that was war. It had been a long time since that bashful smile appeared on Meng Hao's face when he was conning someone. The war had broken out suddenly, forcing him to mature, to grow up. He didn't want to think about what it would be like to watch his family or friends dying in battle in front of him, or what that would turn him into. He didn't dare to contemplate such pain. Therefore, the only thing he could do was make sure that any likelihood of such an outcome was thoroughly wiped away. This time, one of these two paragons will definitely perish. As the murderous aura spread out from Meng Hao, his eyes suddenly went wide, and he looked down at the spell formation beneath his feet. The sun was gone, but there was still something else that remained behind. It was in that exact same moment that the paragon puppet's eyes locked onto Paragon Chuanfang, and its enraged voice echoed out into the starry sky. "Was it you who severed my thread?" Paragon Chuanfang's heart began to pound as he sensed something locking down on him, something locking onto, not just his body, but his mind and his soul. The voice which had just spoken was filled with killing intent and murderous intentions. There was a brutality to it, something that made the starry sky around it turn icy. At the same time that the voice rang out, the paragon puppet vanished, then reappeared directly in front of Chuanfang. Chuanfang didn't hesitate at all to fall back at top speed, his heart filled with an intense sensation of imminent crisis. However, no matter how fast he tried to flee, he couldn't match the soul fragment of Chumantai which had been sleeping inside the paragon puppet. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the paragon puppet extended its right hand and made a grasping motion. In reality, it was manipulating the flow of time, reaching backward a few moments into the past. "Get back here," said the icy voice which echoed out of the paragon puppet's mouth. Then, the puppet's hand wrenched backward. Off in the distance, Paragon Chuanfang had been fleeing, but then his face flickered as he sensed an enormous hand in front of him, grabbing at his soul, pulling him toward the paragon puppet. "You're not Igu, and you're not Meng Hao. Who are you?" Paragon Chuanfang's face flickered as he bit down on the tip of his tongue, spitting out a mouthful of life essence blood and simultaneously performing a double-handed incantation gesture. That mouthful of blood became an entire sea which spread out in all directions and transformed into a blood-colored magical symbol. Break. It was a critical moment in which there was no time for contemplation. Xuanfang attacked without any consideration for the negative ramifications to himself. Everything around him twisted, and the blood-colored magical symbol exploded, sending out a huge shockwave that he used to shake free of the paragon puppet's time-traveling hand. Then he shot back at top speed, mind reeling and heart pounding from the realization of how powerful the paragon puppet was. In fact, he was now coming to the conclusion that severing Meng Hao's connection to this puppet might have been a big mistake. Damn it, this is no puppet. There's a soul supporting it from the inside. This is a discarnate soul possession. Having come to this conclusion, Chuanfang's face looked more unsightly than ever, and the sensation of crisis within him grew even more intense. However, no matter how he tried to flee, the sensation only got worse. He didn't feel like he was breaking free from anything. On the contrary, he felt more locked down than ever, incapable of extricating himself. Then the paragon puppet's eyes flickered, and its hand clenched into a fist before punching out. Boom! The fist strike causing rumbling sounds to fill the void as an explosive force suddenly appeared right in front of Paragon Chuanfang. Despite how powerful he was, blood sprayed out of his mouth and he fell back, a look of shock on his face. Then he looked at the paragon puppet and suddenly seemed to have realized something, and his face fell. "Why, you're not a cultivator from the paragon immortal realm. Why, you're from the barbarian devil realm." Barbarian? A gleam of reminiscence could be seen in the eyes of the paragon puppet before it then took another step forward and launched another blow at Paragon Chuanfang. Booms rang out as Chuanfang fell back, blood spraying out of his mouth. 1. This barbarian is a term that comes up a lot in Beseech the Devil, and is a bloodline clan people something like that in that novel. Unfortunately, some translators have transliterated it oddly as man, which I think is incredibly confusing. Meanwhile, back in Meng Hao's position, the detonation of the sun revealed something completely shocking. There, numerous strands of light formed the outline of a spell formation design. Within the heart of that spell formation was a bow. It was an azure bow floating in the nucleus of the spell formation, emitting boundless light. This was Paragon 9 Seal's precious treasure. Furthermore, Meng Hao was currently located above that spell formation, directly facing that bow. The sun might have exploded, but the sun was only the outer shell. Meng Hao paid no heed to the battle ensuing between Chuanfang and the paragon puppet. Instead, he looked down at the bow, his eyes glittering. Then he reached out as if to grab it. As soon as he reached out to touch the bow, it shuddered, as if in response. At the same time, the paragon's blood inside of his nirvana fruit began to boil in an unprecedented fashion. Then the bow then began to slowly rise up toward Meng Hao. Simultaneously, within the sealed mountains and seas, All of the mountains began to shake, and the Qianwu turtles in the celestial ponds began to howl as if because of some intense provocation. At the same time, the will of the mountain and sea realm also seemed to erupt explosively. Patriarch Reliance's eyes went wide, as if he too could sense what was happening, and unexpectedly he threw his head back and roared. At the same time, wave-like ripples filled the area around guiding Tri-Rain, and as for Mount Daqing, although it seemed to be just an ordinary mountain, all of a sudden, a completely extraordinary aura began to stir within it. Also on Patriarch Reliance's back was Donghu. A pearl floated in front of him, which radiated dazzling light. Donghu looked at it thoughtfully and then looked up into the vast sky. My life has been devoted to preparing this treasure for someone I don't know. Is it possible that the fated master of this object is him? As these things occurred, the cultivators who wielded the magical devices of the three Dians redoubled their efforts, joining the mountain and sea cultivators to relentlessly attack the quivering seal which covered the realm. It was also in this moment that rumbling sounds could be heard as the bow emerged from the spell formation and came to rest in Meng Hao's hand. The bow was azure, the string was black, and there were no arrows. However, there was a boundless ancientness which erupted from within it. It was as if in the moment he grabbed a hold of the bow, all of the qi and blood inside of Meng Hao erupted. The starry sky vibrated, and wild colors flashed. Meng Hao's hair flew about and his energy rocketed up. However, his body instantly began to wither as his qi and blood were rapidly absorbed by the bow. Meng Hao's eyes grew bright, and he took a deep breath. Then he looked up toward the 16th heaven, his eyes flickering with killing intent. Xuan Fang is pinned down by the paragon puppet. If I join in, then it might be possible to kill him. However, it would be better to take down Paragon Mythdragon when he's injured. There won't be another chance to do that. Yes, I'll kill Mythdragon. He made his decision in a split second, then took a step forward and transformed into a beam of light that shot toward the rest of the land masses up above. As he flew up, the majestic spell formation which surrounded him followed. His feet remained on the spell formation, and his hand grasped the azure bow. He was like the sun itself, rising with majestic splendor toward the land masses in the starry sky. The ordinary outsiders and their imperial lords were all shaken, and quickly flew forward to try to stop Meng Hao. Paragon Xuan Fang's eyes went wide, and although he instantly grew very anxious, there was nothing he could do but watch Meng Hao fly up. As of this moment, the outsiders were all astonished. As of this moment, the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm were all staring at Meng Hao as he rose up into the sky like a sun. Meng Hao's father, Su Qing, his fellow clan members, his friends, and all of the other cultivators who were watching, no matter how far away they were, could see the sun-like figure transforming into something like an arrow of light that shot toward the land masses up above. I am not indispensable to this war, Meng Hao murmured. If I weren't here, there would be someone else who could take my place and follow a similar path as mine. I can be a game piece, I can lack my own will, I can be a sacrifice, I just hope that my family lives, that my wife lives, and that my friends live. With that, he drew the bowstring back. Chapter 1370, Bow in Hand. Chapter 1371, Paragon in Terror. He was going to kill a paragon. Kill outsider Paragon Mythdragon. As he pulled back on the bowstring, qi and blood surged through his body, as though the azure bow were sucking away at his life force. It began to shine with dazzling light, light that was none other than the convergence of his life force and everything that was him. It was also the light of his very soul. Draw the bow, converge the light, form an arrow. A dazzling spell formation appeared beneath his feet, and he took a step forward, his eyes flashing like lightning. When he released his grip on the bowstring, the string instantly began to vibrate with a shocking noise that left all the outsiders' minds reeling. It was a noise that could rip apart the heavens, a noise that resonated in the minds of all cultivators and outsiders, a noise which represented death and killing. Anyone with an unstable mind would find their thoughts in complete disorder and would feel terror rising up within them. Such people would even find their cultivation bases thrown into chaos, wrested completely beyond their control. That sound could destabilize Dao hearts. As Meng Hao released his grip, the bowstring began to propel the arrow formed from the light of his life force. It instantly seemed to suck in all the light in the area, turning the starry sky black and making the dazzling arrow the center of all attention. Kill him, Meng Hao growled as the light arrow began to speed forth. At first, it wasn't necessarily very impressive. However, in the blink of an eye, it grew from 30 meters long to 300, then 3,000, and then 30,000. It took only a split second for the 30,000-meter-long light arrow to begin rumbling toward the millions of outsiders who were trying to block the way to the other land masses, a group which included imperial lords. Heaven and earth went dim, a massive wind kicked up, and the outsiders' minds were completely shaken. This, that bow, this cultivator. Massive waves of shock battered at the hearts of the outsiders. Meng Hao was like an immortal divinity. The glowing spell formation beneath his feet illuminated him, and the azure bow was so striking that the outsiders couldn't help but stare at it. The outsider imperial lords who were trying to block Meng Hao were shaken, and then roared as they transformed into their true outsider beast shapes, unleashing their cultivation base power as they sallied forth to try to destroy the light arrow. However, a moment later, the light of the arrow engulfed them, and booms rang out, mixed with blood-curdling screams. The imperial lords were completely incapable of blocking the arrow, and after it passed by, they were all dead. Gasps could be heard as the light arrow then blasted into the outsider army itself. Wherever it passed, scorching light gave rise to miserable shrieks. Countless outsiders were directly incinerated as the huge arrow cut a gaping path through the army. Over 1 million outsiders, a host of imperial lords, none of them were capable of doing a single thing to stop the arrow from piercing through the army. Rumbling sounds could be heard as it shot toward the 16th heaven and then hit it. The entire 16th heaven began to shake, and vast crevices snaked out. It only took a moment for the entire land mass to be on the verge of collapsing. Meng Hao himself transformed into a beam of light that followed the arrow. He shot through the path that had been carved out through the army, and as he closed in on the 16th heaven, he once again began to pull back on the bowstring. "Myth Dragon," he roared, voice bursting with killing intent, a shockingly murderous aura radiating out from him. After firing that first arrow, he was somewhat emaciated, and yet that murderous aura of his was as stupendous as ever. As he pulled back on the bowstring with his right hand, his chi and blood boiled, as once again a vast amount of it was sucked away. Meng Hao now looked extremely gaunt, and yet the second arrow formed completely, whereupon he loosed the string. The arrow of light shot out, bursting with energy that could shake heaven and earth, filled with a viciousness that could exterminate anything and everything. The arrow split open the starry sky as it shot toward the 16th heaven, locking down onto an area in the very center of the land mass. There, Mythdragon was completely absorbed in recovering from his injuries. Suddenly, his eyes opened, and within them could be seen shock and apprehension. Gritting his teeth, he suddenly turned blurry and a second image of him appeared. One of those images then stepped forward, his clone. The clone emerged from Mythdragon's Immortal's Cave, outside of which several dozen Dao Realm outsiders stood guard. All of them were pulsing with energy as they looked up into the sky at the incoming light arrow, behind which flew Meng Hao. By this point, though, there were few people who could do anything to save Mythdragon. On the same token, there was no one who could help Meng Hao. Apparently, this landmass was fated to be the location of their final showdown. Outside of the land mass itself were millions of outsiders, most of whom wouldn't be able to reach the 16th heaven in time. However, all of them could unleash various divine abilities, creating an ocean of magic that rumbled toward the 16th heaven. However, in terms of the time frame involved, such an attack wouldn't do much good unless Meng Hao took an unusually long time to kill Mythdragon. Meanwhile, countless mountain and sea cultivators were in the mountain and sea realm, beneath the seal, watching as Meng Hao single-handedly fought his way through the outsider land masses, all for the purpose of killing a paragon. Everyone, whether they knew Meng Hao personally or not, was shaken. In fact, all of the outsiders from the 17th heaven all the way to the 33rd heaven, who were watching but unable to descend into battle at this exact moment, were equally shocked. By now, Meng Hao was the most majestic and glorious mountain and sea cultivator in the war. In addition to him, there was Siddhagarbha. Their use of the sun and moon, respectively, had made them thorns in the sides of the outsider army. If I can buy enough time, thought Mythdragon, then this Meng Hao will have to face the deadly threat of the ocean of magic unleashed by the others. Mythdragon's clone threw his head back and howled, then flew out to meet the light arrow. The numerous outsider experts who were serving as Dharma protectors all howled as they reverted to their true forms, then gathered in formation around Mythdragon's clone to defend against the light arrow. BO1MM. The light arrow plowed into the outsider Dharma protectors, causing booms to echo out, along with miserable cries. They unleashed various divine abilities, but nothing did any good. Regardless of the levels of their cultivation base or fleshly body, they were instantly transformed into ash. Then that ash faded like wisps of smoke within the light of the arrow. Only Mythdragon's clone remained. He quickly performed a double-handed incantation, transforming into a huge black dragon. Roaring, he head-butted the light arrow, which faltered. Mythdragon's clone howled as he erupted with the aura of a paragon. He might just be a clone, but he was still a paragon, and his unleashing of power caused the arrow to begin to fade away. It was at this point that a cold snort echoed out. Meng Hao, instead of falling back, once again began to pull back the bowstring, unhesitatingly unleashing a third arrow, and then a fourth. The third arrow shot forth in spectacular fashion, causing the clone's eyes to widen in despair. Gritting his teeth, he then opted to self-detonate. The burgeoning self-detonation of a paragon clone instantly caused the land mass of the 16th heaven to begin to crumble, sending fragments blasting out in all directions. The second arrow was destroyed in the self-detonation, but most of the third arrow remained, and as it closed in on the source of the clone's self-detonation, even more explosive self-detonation power erupted out. Massive booms echoed out as the entire land mass was completely destroyed. Within the rubble, Mythdragon's true self flew out from his secluded meditation chamber, blood oozing out of the corners of his mouth. He looked elderly and weak. He had just reached a critical juncture in healing his serious injuries, and had then been interrupted, sacrificing more than half of his blood and essence to make a clone. All of that left him unprecedentedly weak. In fact, this was the weakest he had ever been since becoming a paragon, and also the most dangerous situation he had ever faced. Meng Hao, I'm going to exterminate your entire clan, Mythdragon roared, his eyes crimson. Bleeding from numerous wounds, he fell back into retreat, and yet Meng Hao's fourth arrow was hot on his heels. From the look of it, that arrow would not stop until he was dead. Go ahead and try that, Meng Hao responded to Mythdragon's retreating figure. Even as the words left his mouth, the fourth light arrow suddenly exploded, blasting onto Paragon Mythdragon with full force. Shockwaves spread out into the starry sky, and Paragon Mythdragon let out a blood-curdling scream. However, he wasn't dead yet. Although he was coughing up blood, he still managed to scramble away in flight, simultaneously transforming into a 30,000-meter-long black dragon. And yet, that black dragon was a mass of mangled gore, with a severely weakened aura that was on the verge of dropping out of the Paragon stage. Save me, Chuan Fang, Mythdragon shrieked as he fled. Fear had blossomed in his heart. This was the most desperate situation he had ever been in since becoming a paragon, and also the most terrifying. The feeling of imminent death was even greater than when he had simultaneously fought Sea Dream and the Taoist societies. Nobody can save you, Meng Hao said softly. This mountain and sea war has reached the point where the blood of a paragon is needed to cleanse the heavens. Although his body had been weakened to the point where he was little more than skin and bones, his eyes shone with even more brilliant killing intent than before. He looked at the bow in his hand, then suddenly laughed. Eyes cold and grim, aura bursting with murder and madness, he began to pull back the bowstring back. But then he slowly loosened his grip. It would be quite a pity for him to die like this. A crimson glow rose up in his eyes, and he suddenly took a deep breath. Boundless blood-colored light exploded out from him as the blood demon gradually formed behind him. Unlike previous occasions, the blood demon superimposed with Meng Hao, merging into him. Blood-colored light exploded up from Meng Hao, and he threw his head back and roared. His eyes were bright red, filled with a bloodthirsty, icy light. He took a step forward, and then transformed into a huge sea of blood that shot toward the paragon. He planned to use the blood demon grand magic to consume Mythdragon. /expand. Mythdragon was a mass of blood and gore. He had just managed to avoid being killed by the fourth arrow, but the injuries he had sustained from that arrow were still critically severe. If he were at the peak level of his power, then he had ways to significantly minimize the damage. But now, he could do no such thing. Miserable, bitter laughter rang out from Mythdragon as he fled at top speed. The sensation of deadly crisis in his heart had not lessened, and in fact, he had the feeling that he might not be able to make it out of this situation alive. However, even as bitterness and anguish rose up in his heart, he saw Meng Hao suddenly lower his bow. But then Meng Hao began to glow with a blood-colored light and emanate a sensation of madness, even a thirst for blood. The sight caused Mythdragon's heart to tremble. Meng Hao closed in, and the ocean of magic followed close behind, but was incapable of catching up to him. Meng Hao was surrounded by a massive glow of blood. Having fused with the blood demon and unleashing the blood demon grand magic in this way, he now didn't look like an immortal divinity. He looked like a demon immortal. All of this takes quite some time to describe, but actually happened in the briefest of moments. Meng Hao was now bearing down on Mithragan, who clenched his teeth viciously. He knew that he could not escape what was about to happen and quickly turned to face Meng Hao's charge. The two slammed into each other, and the sea of blood that was Meng Hao swept over Paragon Mithragan as the blood demon grand magic was fully unleashed. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the ocean of magic closed in. Mithragan screamed, breaking free from the sea of blood, which then transformed into a blood-colored rock. With a piercing cry, the rock began to chase Mithragan. Numerous blood-colored mountains appeared, as well as the Paragon Bridge, which also emitted a blood-colored glow. Blood sprayed out of Mithragan's mouth, his cultivation base power having long since dropped from the level of a paragon to that of an imperial lord. At this point, there was little he could do to fight back against Meng Hao. He could only laugh bitterly as Meng Hao in rock form grabbed onto him and unleashed the blood demon grand magic again. In the blink of an eye, boundless chi and blood power was sucked out of Mithragan's body to be madly absorbed by Meng Hao. Mithragan struggled, but there was no stopping what was happening. Beneath their feet, the 16th heaven was collapsing rapidly, and at the same time, the ocean of magic was barreling toward them. Off in the distance, Xianxia watched silently, sadness flickering in his eyes. He knew that Mithragan would not be able to escape. Although Xianxia was adept at strategy and warfare, there was nothing he could do to help Mithragan in this situation. Even Xianxia himself felt a sensation of deadly crisis. He was having a difficult time dealing with the attacks of the Paragon puppet, and was in full retreat, coughing up blood the entire time. At the same time, the seal over the mountain and sea realm was beginning to show signs of crumbling beneath the combined bombardment of the three great Taoist societies. The three young men who wielded the Diyin treasures, the ordinary mountain and sea cultivators, Paragon Sea Dream, and Patriarch Reliance. Once that seal was broken, the mountain and sea cultivators would burst out upon an outsider army which now lacked paragons. Having no paragons meant certain defeat. The greatest danger was now to the moon. It was surrounded by outsiders, none of whom were backing down in the slightest. There were also imperial lords there who were dead set on destroying it. It didn't matter if their paragon was dead or even the rest of the army, they would accomplish their mission. They would ensure that the moon ceased to exist. All aspects of the war seemed to have reached a critical mass, ripe to explode. The first such explosion would not be Meng Hao, nor the paragon puppet. Despite the fact that Siddhigarbha was fighting it out to the bitter end, the moon couldn't evade or dodge and was surrounded by outsider cultivators. Their combined attacks finally caused the moon to collapse, sending countless fragments and rubble out in all directions. Boom! The moon was no more. As it collapsed, Siddhigarbha coughed up a mouthful of blood, even as his bitter laughter rang out. A second boom rang out. It was the second explosion to ring out in this critical moment. This time, though, the sound emanated from the seal over the mountain and sea realm. The beams of light which had descended from the 17th heavens and above were collapsing due to the combined power of all the mountain and sea realm cultivators. Cracks spread out in all directions, eventually joining together until the seal shattered like a giant mirror. Heaven and earth went dark, and the starry sky shook, as countless mountain and sea cultivators burst out, brimming with madness and killing intent. The three great Taoist societies, Paragon Sea Dream, numerous Tao realm experts, the three young men wielding the Diyin treasures, all burst out from within the mountain and sea realm. However, it was in that moment that a third explosion rang out, from the location where Meng Hao and Mithragan had been fighting. Mixed within the booming explosion was an unyielding roar. That roar came out of the mouth of Mithragan, who was completely enveloped by the sea of blood. His fleshly body was withering rapidly as his chi and blood, cultivation base, and soul were all being rapidly absorbed. It wasn't that he hadn't attempted to self-detonate. Meng Hao's time-walking technique, coupled with the serious injuries that had been inflicted, dropped Mithragan's power below that of a paragon, and he simply could. He could only watch, wide-eyed, as Meng Hao's blood demon grand magic sucked away his chi and blood, his cultivation base and his soul. "I won't give in." Mithragan's woeful laughter echoed out until it ended with a muffled grunt. The enormous black dragon closed its eyes as it sank down forever into the sea of blood. As of this moment, a paragon had perished. More accurately speaking, this was the second paragon to die in the war between the mountain and sea realm and the 33 heavens. The first could be considered to be Igu, who had been transformed into a puppet. The surrounding outsiders were in shock as they watched Mythdragon die. Then, terror began to rise up within their hearts and minds. Our paragon perished. This is impossible. The outsiders were completely flabbergasted. The forces who were in the 17th through 33rd heavens were dumbstruck, including the powerful experts among them who felt their hearts palpitating. The sea of blood seethed as Mythdragon vanished, after which the blood began to congeal, growing smaller and smaller until it was the shape of a person with Meng Hao's face. His face was pale, he was emaciated, and he bubbled with swirling curse power. However, he completely ignored that as he looked up at the seal that had constrained the mountain and sea realm, which was now crumbling, and the massive swarms of cultivators charging out into battle. Then he looked over and saw the moon collapsing. Finally, he turned to look at Xianfang, who was bearing the brunt of a fist strike from the paragon puppet. Blood sprayed out of Xianfang's mouth, and bitter laughter rang out. Suddenly, even as the paragon puppet closed in on him, Xianfang suddenly began to initiate self-detonation. Xianfang was choosing to blow himself up. He was well aware that, just like Mythdragon, he was destined to perish. He also knew that if he died fighting, he might be able to kill some enemies in the process. But that wasn't how he wanted to end things. Taking a few enemies out wasn't satisfactory to him. He wanted his death to bury the whole mountain and sea realm. Madness gleamed in his eyes. Because of his mastery of the essence of time, it was essentially impossible for anyone to prevent him from self-detonating. The paragon puppet's eyes flickered, and it suddenly backed up. The soul light that originated with Chuman Tai vanished, and the puppet was once again completely connected to Meng Hao. Meng Hao looked on with a grim expression on his face. Xianfang's mad laughter filled the starry sky, echoing out in all directions. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew that he had been defeated, completely and utterly defeated. In fact, his defeat could not be any more thorough. The nail in the coffin was that Meng Hao was now reconnected to the paragon puppet. The discarnate soul which had appeared had locked Xianfang down, and he had finally come to understand how brutally decisive Meng Hao was. He could only laugh bitterly. Before the battle had begun, neither he nor any of the other outsiders in the 33 heavens could possibly have imagined that the war would be this difficult. In their minds, this war would be one in which the 33 heavens exterminated the mountain and sea realm. They wouldn't even need the help of those two other powerful forces. They could do it all by themselves. But now, the fighting had reached the point that Xianfang was struck with a sudden feeling. Is it possible that the 33 heavens will actually lose in the end? Xianfang could sense that Mythdragon's spiritual soul and physical soul had both dispersed. Looking over at Meng Hao congealing out of the sea of blood, he said, "Meng Hao, you've beaten me in this battle. I made two mistakes. The first is that I should have risked everything to strike you down that first time. I should have struck hard and ensured that you were completely and utterly dead. I knew that you were important, but I mistakenly took you too lightly. My second mistake was underestimating the mountain and sea realm. We should not have split up our forces. Hear me, my brothers in the 17th through 33rd heavens. You must remember everything that you have seen happen here. When you descend, do not split up your forces. Attack in unison. Go all out to destroy the mountain and sea realm. Spare nothing. Do not vacillate because of thoughts of living or dying. If you do, victory cannot be certain. As for the 2 8 essences paragons, I hope that my death in this battle will be avenged by the two of you. Take Meng Hao's head and place it as a trophy upon my grave. To all of my people who are here fighting the mountain and sea realm right now, there is no retreat in this battle. If you retreat, you will die. There is no home to return to. Your homes will all be destroyed. If you want a chance to live, then you must fight to the bitter end. In that case, even if you die, it won't be long before the rest of our people come to avenge us. In war, there is no right or wrong. There is only victory and defeat. I am Paragon Xianfang, and I hereby sacrifice myself to help the 33 heavens destroy the mountain and sea realm." Xianfang threw his head back and laughed, then swished his sleeve. Blinding light began to radiate off of him, as well as powerful ripples. Then, the explosive beginning of the self-detonation began to erupt. At the same time, the other heavens which were under his control began to move, transforming into what looked like sharp blades that began to stab down toward the mountain and sea realm. Vicious, suicidal grimaces of madness appeared on the faces of the millions of remaining outsiders. As the land masses descended from above, they charged murderously toward the mountain and sea realm. Use these land masses to crush the mountain and sea realm. That was my plan all along, and will make my name infamous for all eternity. Therefore, I shall build that infamy to an even higher level right now. Xianxia threw his head back and laughed with deranged madness. Chapter 1372, Myth Dragon Perishes. Chapter 1373, Mountains Crumble, Seas Are Destroyed. Using the land masses as battering rams against the mountain and sea realm truly was an act of madness. It was a strategy that Xianxia had begun to unfold with the second heaven, and had then entrusted to Mythdragon to fully carry out. However, the price to pay was a steep one, the wrath of the entirety of the 33 heavens. Only if the plan resulted in a grand victory could it have potentially been accepted. But now, Xianxia would never see any such victory. He was moments away from perishing. After I die, the true deluge will come. Xianxia's laughter rang out, filled with madness. Since he had already sacrificed the second heaven and the other land masses in a deadly attack, he didn't object to sending everything else to crush the mountain and sea realm at his hour of death. This was the only way left that he could deal an unprecedentedly critical blow to the mountain and sea realm, and thus buy a chance for the 17th heavens and beyond to gain victory. "This is all that I can do," he said. He waved his sleeve, sending the land masses down toward the mountain and sea realm, surrounded by millions upon millions of outsiders. Then Xianxia closed his eyes, whereupon a heaven-shaking, earth-shattering power of detonation was unleashed. Xianxia exploded. This was not a partial paragon self-detonation like what had occurred with Mythdragon's clone. This was a full and complete paragon self-detonation. His cultivation base had not dropped, and although he had sustained injuries, he still had the full cultivation base of a paragon. He was even able to add his own essence into the explosion. The starry sky was set aflame, the heavens shook, and the entire mountain and sea realm vibrated. The power of the self-detonation did not just blast about wildly. Instead, Xianxia managed to direct the power of the blast into a propelling force, which sent the heavenly land masses down toward the mountain and sea realm with indescribable speed. Although the mountain and sea realm had prepared to be battered by heavenly land masses, this barrage was unlike anything that had happened before. This time, the land masses were being propelled by the force of Xianxia's self-detonation, making them like deadly blades that stabbed down with incredible force. The war was now erupting with unprecedented intensity. Booms echoed out continuously. The starry sky trembled and the lands quaked. Upon the land mass closest to the mountain and sea realm, the seas evaporated and the mountains crumbled. The entire mass of land crumbled and then burst into pieces. The three great Taoist societies attacked in unison, drawing upon their most profound Taoist scriptures, unleashing their most shocking Taoist magics. The immortal ancient Taoist rite spared no cost to summon numerous Tao projections to fight against the incoming land masses. The sublime flow sword grotto formed a majestic sword formation of 1,080,000 flying swords, which whistled up to meet the land masses. The Nine Seas god world had sustained the most casualties of all, and yet called upon equally terrifying resources. Countless sea dragons flew out, along with innumerable cultivators. Numerous god world gates appeared which, upon opening, unleashed one giant after another. The giants then linked arms, forming a huge wall that braced for the impact of the land masses of the various heavens. The disciples of the three Diyins also put everything on the line, joining forces to unleash a shocking attack with their magical items. Paragon Sea Dream's face was pale white, and blood was oozing out of her mouth. Ignoring any negative effect it would have on her already serious wounds, she flew out toward the land masses and began to attack them. The Paragon puppet was now under Meng Hao's control, and it also launched forth. Then there were Meng Hao and K. Siddhagarbha. As of this moment, they were doing everything they could to block the incoming land masses. The land masses of the various heavens were being blasted apart, and yet the fragments and rubble continued to shoot down at incredible speed, piercing into the mountain and sea realm. Wherever they passed, mass destruction was wreaked. Cultivators were smashed to death like ants beneath mighty hands of destruction. Miserable screams rang out constantly. Vast hosts of cultivators of the mountain and sea realm joined forces, unleashing a sea of magical techniques that rose to meet the land masses. And yet, there was nothing they could do to stop the onslaught. BO1 a massive remnant of one of the land masses, despite being broken and in ruins, was still mighty enough to evaporate the third sea and even slam into the third mountain. The mountain began to crumble. The sea was destroyed. Light arrows shot out from Meng Hao's location, slamming into the various heavenly land masses, bashing them to pieces. However, there was only so much he could do. Even with the added efforts of the three great Taoist societies, Paragon Sea Dream and everyone else, only about 70% of the land masses could be destroyed, which wasn't enough to save that mountain and sea. Soon, the third mountain was in a state of complete collapse. The mountain and sea realm was in chaos. Countless cultivators couldn't hold back from screaming in agony as they watched the third mountain crumble into rubble. Tears streamed down cheeks, especially among the cultivators who were originally from the third mountain and sea. Their home was gone. The Xuanwu turtle atop the third mountain died an agonizing death. The third mountain vanished, and the sound of its destruction rang in the ears of the mountain and sea cultivators. More and more of them began to weep. Next was the destruction of the fourth sea. It transformed into nothing more than a mist. Then came the fourth mountain. The fourth mountain and sea represented reincarnation and the underworld, but now it was shattering into nothing. Henceforth, there would be no sun or moon in the mountain and sea realm, nor would there be any reincarnation. More people began to weep, and yet those tears led to even more unswerving determination. The apocalyptic rubble of the various land masses incinerated the fifth sea before it finally came to a stop. Xuan Fang had resorted to self-detonation, ending his own life, and yet unleashing an unprecedented level of damage and destruction onto the mountains and seas. The number of cultivators who died was impossible to count. Furthermore, the mountain and sea realm had gone all out with its power to block the attack. Had it not, then the destruction would not have stopped at the base of the fifth mountain. The mountain and sea realm would have sustained even more severe casualties. Now that the bombardment of the heavenly land masses had ended, the army of outsiders poured in. The war had reached a fever pitch with such rapidity that people had almost no time to consider how to react. Cultivators and outsiders alike were unable to process it all. And yet the fighting did not stop. The millions upon millions of outsiders were met by countless mountain and sea cultivators, whose tears flowed as they fought back against the onslaught. Paragons attacked, Tao realm experts attacked, imperial lords held back no divine abilities. As soon as the two sides met, blood flowed. Everything was stained with red and the starry sky glowed with crimson light. The flames of war raged in front of the fifth mountain. Blood flowed like seawater, and the din of slaughter rang out constantly. By this point, the Paragon-level fighters were limited in what they could do. After all, the outsiders were many. But there were also mountain and sea cultivators on the battlefield, and it could be difficult to distinguish between the two. Furthermore, the outsiders attacked with complete insanity, ensuring that the fighting was close and fierce. The battlefield soon turned into a vast sea of blood. Meng Hao was there on the battlefield, and wherever he went, death followed. His eyes were crimson as he glared at the surrounding outsiders, and by this point, he had no need to unleash magical techniques to carry out slaughter. He transformed into a sea of blood that washed over them and absorbed their life force. Sea Dream was there, as was the Paragon puppet. Both of them were using similar tactics as Meng Hao to unleash the power of Paragons to dispatch the outsider imperial lords, which were now all dead. The mountain and sea cultivators fought with madness, and the outsiders with complete viciousness. The slaughter being carried out was shocking. When those on the front lines grew exhausted, there were others behind them who were happy to continue the fight. The battle stretched on outside of the fifth mountain, and it was hard to say when it would end. The number of outsiders was dropping at a horrific rate. With the three great Taoist societies, the Dian disciples, and the combined power of all the other mountain and sea cultivators, they ensured that, despite facing millions upon millions of outsiders, their superior position made them like a grindstone that crushed all of the outsiders who charged the fifth mountain. The entire time, the 17th through 33rd heavens looked on reticently. They did not interfere in any way, but simply watched, observing the tactics and methods of the mountain and sea realm, committing them to memory, and using augury in order to prepare ways to deal with and neutralize them. Eventually, the fighting ended. A vast sea of blood now existed outside the fifth mountain. The bedraggled remnants of the outsider army began to fall back, and the mountain and sea realm cultivators let them go, too exhausted to pursue. Meng Hao's vision was fading, and his cultivation base was drying up. He bit the tip of his tongue to regain some clarity, then looked down to find his clothing so soaked with blood that it was sticking to his body. It felt disgusting. He looked up into the starry sky for a moment before sitting down cross-legged and closing his eyes to focus on healing. When he did that, the sound of the weeping of the mountain and sea cultivators drifted into his ears. They wept for their homes. They wept for their friends and family who had fallen in battle. They wept because of the grief which filled their hearts. Bitterness washed over Meng Hao as he realized that the war wasn't over, and yet, despite all odds, the mountain and sea realm had eked out another victory. They had survived against the first heaven's onslaught, resisted the second through sixth heavens, and blocked the seventh through 16th heavens. The price they had paid was immense. 4 entire mountains and seas had been destroyed, and countless cultivators had died. The sun and moon had been lost, and yet they had still come out victorious. Despite all that, little joy could be found in the hearts of the fighters. Everyone was exhausted. Su Qing, many members of the Fang clan, and other faces familiar to Meng Hao had all participated in the battle. Now that the fighting had stopped for the moment, everyone was lost in their own thoughts and feelings. When they looked up into the starry sky, it was with mixed emotions. Everyone knew that the war wasn't even half over. Soon, they would face the 17th through 33rd heavens. That would be the final battle. The final battle for the mountain and sea realm. The enemy would be prepared to counter the techniques they had used in the fighting thus far. Furthermore, even more powerful paragons would be coming. At that time, one side would be wiped out, or the other would. By means of Su Qing, Paragon Sea Dream sent orders out into the various mountains and seas regarding how to rest and reorganize. The sea of blood outside the 5th mountain was filled with restrictive spells, as was the 5th mountain. The mountain and sea realm sprang into action. Most cultivators buried their tears and focused on carrying out the tasks assigned to the various sects and clans by Paragon Sea Dream. The Fang clan was completely mobilized, as were all of the mountain and sea lords. It was at this point that Meng Hao received a request from Paragon Sea Dream. The 33 hells should be opened. Meng Hao, I will pick 33 chosen from the mountain and sea realm to go with you into the 33 hells and acquire the legacies therein. You must become stronger. Furthermore, the 33 chosen I select must search within the 33 hells for their own personal Tao. It is there that Paragon 9 seals left incredible good fortune behind for the later generation of the mountain and sea realm. You and the chosen will have 10 months. After 10 months pass, the 17th through 33rd heavens will descend, and the final battle for the mountain and sea realm will begin. Chapter 1374, Returning to the 33 Hells. Of course, the 33 Hells contain falsehoods and danger. After a moment of silence, Sea Dream went on to elucidate to Meng Hao the various dangers to which she referred. Meng Hao's eyes glittered, and after hearing her description, he nodded his head. Time passed. For the time being, the warfare ceased. The cultivators of the mountain and sea realm, hearts filled with grief and reticence, carried out the orders of Paragon Sea Dream, making preparations in various areas to meet the onslaught that was coming in 10 months. Everyone was preparing for that final battle, causing profound pressure to weigh upon the hearts of everyone in the mountain and sea realm. It was as if they would either die in silence or explode with savagery. Some people contemplated whether or not the mountain and sea realm would even exist by the time the war ended. However, such lines of thinking were like a bottomless pit that left one feeling frozen, without even the strength to continue breathing. Because of the destruction of the sun and moon, the mountain and sea realm was left with only the blackness of empty space. Within that darkness, the mortals sat trembling in fear, and even the cultivators felt pressure weighing down on them. After carrying out the tasks assigned by Paragon Sea Dream, many of the cultivators chose to return to their family and friends. Such time spent with loved ones was something to be cherished at a time like this. There were some male and female cultivators who had been close friends for years, and yet had developed more deep feelings that they never had the courage to reveal. Now, hearts were bared, and declarations of love were made. There were some people with long-standing grudges and enmities who chose to finally let such hard feelings go. It was as if people were preparing for their own deaths and cherishing the time they had left. Some people pondered why this war was happening. Half of the 33 heavens had been destroyed, and half of the mountain and sea realm was lost. The number of outsiders and mountain and sea cultivators who had died was vast. Why were they fighting? What was the purpose of this war? What was the purpose of the dying? What was the meaning of it all? However, such questions weren't really important. What was important was that the war would continue, and the fragile balance between life and death would reveal the true difference between darkness and light. The mountain and sea realm rested and recovered. As various parties made final preparations for war, Meng Hao met with the 33 chosen whom he would lead into the 8th mountain and sea. The majority of those 33 chosen were strangers to him. The rest he was familiar with, for example, Jai Yin. None of the chosen from the 3 great Taoist societies were participants. To Meng Hao's delight, Chen Fan and Wang Yaokai were among those present. Although Fatty wasn't there, to have these 2 longtime comrades present helped Meng Hao to recall some of his former wonderful memories, despite the pressure that weighed down on his heart. The rest of the cultivators from the other mountains and seas were people who Meng Hao didn't recognize. However, they knew exactly who he was, and as soon as they laid eyes on him, their eyes burned with zeal. None of these chosen had cultivation bases in the Tao realm. All were in somewhere in the ancient realm, some being in the early stage of that realm, some at the very peak. As soon as they met, all of the chosen clasped hands and bowed. "Greetings, Crown Prince." "Greetings, Crown Prince of the mountains and seas." Chen Fan wore a smile as he looked at Meng Hao, and it seemed as if he were thinking back to events in the Reliance sect. Wang Yaokai had long since lost the use of his eyes. However, his murderous aura made him almost look completely forbidding and unapproachable. Despite his lack of eyes, he seemed to be looking at Meng Hao. After a moment passed, he clasped hands and bowed. Li Linger's emotions were the most mixed of all. Recently, more than one person had asked about the marriage engagement between her and Meng Hao. The way she had fled that marriage years ago now seemed very childish. Later, she had watched as Meng Hao rose to prominence and seen his dazzling display of might in the War of the Mountains and Seas. She sometimes wondered what would have happened if she hadn't fled that marriage. Even though Meng Hao had also chosen to flee, in terms of the law and of morality, she was technically Meng Hao's beloved partner. Jai Yin had even more mixed feelings. Originally, she had viewed Meng Hao as being inferior to her. Eventually, she took him to be an equal, but that was a long time ago. Eventually, he had risen to the same level of her own clan patriarch, someone to whom she had no choice but to bow her head. She had once believed that such a level was the absolute limit, but then war had broken out, and she came to realize that Meng Hao had long since exceeded the level of a patriarch. He was the type of person toward whom anyone and everyone would bow their heads. Meng Hao looked around at the chosen, and then slowly began to speak. "I have been to the 33 Hells before," he said. "It is a location that Paragon 9 Seals prepared for the cultivators of the mountain and sea realm. There, he left incredible good fortune in the form of 33 powerful experts, sealed therein since of the war of the Paragon immortal realm. Those experts' fleshly bodies were destroyed, but their souls remain behind. They are like wellsprings of power, and if you can absorb them, your cultivation base will advance by leaps and bounds. However, the process is not as simple and easy as it sounds. There is great danger. If you fail in your effort, you will perish. Furthermore, even if you succeed, and your cultivation base experiences incredible growth, the price you will pay is that in the future you will find it very difficult to make any further advancement with your cultivation base. You will essentially be terminating any future possibilities. However, in exchange, your cultivation base will be no less powerful than that of a Tao sovereign. In addition, if you are willing to sacrifice some of your longevity to part with some of your own life force essence, then you can acquire a cultivation base power that exceeds that of a Tao sovereign. However, that will only last for a single 60-year cycle, after which you will die forever." Upon hearing this, the 33 chosen gaped in shock. This explanation was somewhat different from their previous understanding. However, after seeing the serious look on Meng Hao's face, they could sense that he was telling the truth. The 33 chosen remained silent, but none of them backed out. Meng Hao looked out at the group, then said, "Upon entering, I will escort all of you. We will go together to acquire the good fortune that exists within the 33 Hells. Another matter to consider is that within the 33 Hells are 33 outsider beasts, which will be released when the 33 Hells dissipate." Much of the explanation that Meng Hao was giving was information that had been given to him by Paragon Sea Dream. There is still time to back out now. However, if none of you wish to do so, then let us proceed into the 33 Hells. Meng Hao could see the determination and decisiveness within those 33 pairs of eyes. They didn't need to speak a single word for him to understand what was going on in their minds. If the mountain and sea realm ceased to exist, then there was no need to talk about any type of future whatsoever. Taking this good fortune was a gamble, as well as a huge self-sacrifice, and yet it gave the mountain and sea realm a chance to survive. Without another word, Meng Hao flicked his sleeve, transforming into a beam of light that carried the entire group toward the 33 hells of the 8th mountain and sea. As they neared that region of complete darkness, Meng Hao relied upon the power of his current cultivation base to forcibly open the entrance. Upon entering, the 33 chosen found themselves within a boundless mist, beneath which broken and shattered lands were just barely visible, a place where intense magical battles had been fought. Gradually, a huge figure became visible within the mists, which seethed as a mighty roar echoed out. Suddenly, a long iron chain flew out in the direction of Meng Hao and the others. At the same time, a voice rang out which shook the minds of all present. Hungry, hungry, so hungry. For everyone behind Meng Hao, this was their first time coming to this place, and the incredibly shocking figure left their minds on the verge of lapsing into unconsciousness. Meng Hao snorted coldly, waving his finger in the direction of the iron chain. "Screw the hell off," he said. The snort echoed like thunder, leaving the crowd behind him shaken. His words seemed to carry the weight of natural law, and as the iron chain closed in, it began to tremble, and then simply exploded. Meng Hao's voice was like an arrow that pierced the mists, transforming into countless invisible magical symbols that shot toward the enormous figure. Then he waved his finger back and forth, causing the entire world to rumble around them, and the mist to churn. Gradually, all of the mists began to move off to either side. Soon it was revealed, exactly what had been lurking there in wait. It was a giant, covered in iron chains, roaring. Based on the look in its eyes, it was sentient, and it trembled beneath the force of Meng Hao's gaze. "This is the first outsider beast within the 33 hells," Meng Hao said coolly. Then he proceeded forward, followed by all the chosen. They passed by the giant, who roared the entire time, and yet whose eyes were filled with dread. Clearly, what it feared was not the 33 chosen, but rather Meng Hao. It feared Meng Hao, and the intensely murderous aura upon him. It was an aura that no one else could detect without a sufficient cultivation base. However, those who could sense it would be able to tell that he had cut down paragons. Meng Hao led the group toward the central stone stele of the first area, and when they reached the edge of the rift leading inside, the giant behind him suddenly spoke in a somewhat garbled voice. "You have killed paragons." "Yup, I killed one, enslaved another, and forced a third to self-detonate. You are far from being a paragon, so don't worry, I won't kill you." With that, Meng Hao stepped into the rift. The crowd behind him exchanged speechless glances and then hurried to follow. Li Linger wore a strange expression, and Chen Fan chuckled hoarsely. Wang Yaokai's lips quivered. Although none of them said anything, Meng Hao's words seemed exceedingly audacious to them. As for the chain-wrapped giant, he gasped in fear, shock filling his face. His simple brain was not one that was inclined to mind games. He could sense the aura on Meng Hao and could understand his words and was left shivering. Finally, he bowed his head.